Welcome to Marple Whispers. I'm Sean, and here, every whisper hides a mystery. These Miss Marple stories are my own creations, written just for you. So lean in and let the clues begin. In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a dazzling sapphire pendant vanishes from a locked aviary during Lady Hargrove's garden party, leaving a trail of scattered feathers and suspicion. As whispers of deceit swirl among guests, gossipy Miss Finch, nervous maid Clara, and gruff gardener Wilkins, Miss Jane Marple unravels a web of secrets, from a staged decoy bird escape to a hidden compartment, revealing a desperate act of theft driven by loyalty and need, all in the shadow of Elmwood Manor's enchanting birdcage. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Elmwood Manor. The village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in the gentle folds of the English countryside, a place where time seemed to move at the leisurely pace of an afternoon stroll. Its thatched cottages and winding lanes had changed little since Miss Jane Marple's girlhood, though the inhabitants, she often reflected, remained as predictably unpredictable as ever. Human nature, after all, was a constant, whether in the bustling streets of London or the quiet hedgerows of her home. On this particular morning in early autumn, with the first hints of frost glistening on the rose bushes outside her window, Miss Marple sat in her cozy sitting room, her knitting needles clicking softly in rhythm with the ticking of the grandfather clock. The postman, Mr. Jenkins, arrived promptly at 9:30, as was his custom, and deposited a small stack of letters through the brass slot in her door. Among the usual bills and circulars was an envelope of fine cream paper, sealed with a crest that spoke of old money and older traditions. Miss Marple set aside her wool and adjusted her spectacles, peering at the address written in a flowing, elegant hand. It was from Lady Evelyn Hargrove of Elmwood Manor, a grand old house perched on a hill just beyond the village proper. The two women were acquaintances rather than close friends, Lady Hargrove being of that social set which hosted elaborate gatherings, while Miss Marple preferred the simplicity of her garden and the occasional village fete. Yet there was a mutual respect between them, born of shared memories from the war years and a common appreciation for the finer points of propriety. Opening the envelope with care, Miss Marple unfolded the invitation. It requested the pleasure of her company at a garden party the following Saturday, to be held in celebration of the restoration of Elmwood Manor's famed aviary. "Do come, dear Miss Marple," the note added in a postscript, "and see my delightful collection of exotic birds, finches from the Indies and parakeets that chatter like old gossips. It promises to be a most diverting afternoon." A faint smile played on Miss Marple's lips as she considered the words. Lady Evelyn was known throughout the county for her eccentric pursuits. Widowed these past 5 years since Colonel Hargrove's passing from a sudden heart ailment during a shooting expedition in Scotland, she had thrown herself into the upkeep of the manor with a fervor that bordered on obsession. The aviary, a domed glass house of intricate iron filigree, had been her husband's pride, housing rare specimens brought back from his travels in the Empire. Now restored to its former glory after years of neglect, it was to be the centerpiece of the event. But it was not just the birds that intrigued Miss Marple. Lady Hargrove possessed a remarkable collection of jewels, inherited from her husband's family and augmented by gifts from his postings abroad. Chief among them was a sapphire pendant, a deep blue stone set in antique gold, rumored to have once belonged to a Maharani. Lady Evelyn wore it often, claiming it brought her luck, though Miss Marple suspected it served more as a talisman against the loneliness that haunted widows of a certain age. She had seen similar behaviors in her own circle, the way Mrs. Price Ridley clung to her late husband's medals, or how old Miss Hartnell displayed her collection of pressed flowers from foreign lands. The invitation stirred a subtle curiosity in Miss Marple's mind. Garden parties at Elmwood were rare these days, what with Lady Hargrove's reputed financial strains. Whispers in the village shop suggested the estate's upkeep was becoming burdensome. Yet here was an announcement of festivity, complete with promises of tea on the lawns and perhaps a string quartet. There was an air of forced gaiety about it, she thought, much like the overly bright smiles one encountered at church bazaars when funds were low. Rising from her chair, Miss Marple crossed to the window, gazing out at the misty fields that led toward the manor. Elmwood stood like a sentinel on its rise, its chimneys piercing the skyline, surrounded by gardens that bloomed even in the chill of approaching winter. Preparations would already be underway, servants airing linens, the cook baking trays of delicate pastries, and the gardener, that reliable Mr. Wilkins, trimming the hedges to perfection. Lady Hargrove herself would be overseeing it all, her lavender-scented presence flitting from room to room, ensuring every detail aligned with her impeccable standards. Miss Marple decided she would attend, not merely for the diversion, though that was welcome enough in the monotony of village life, but because such gatherings often revealed the undercurrents of human drama, the jealous glances, the whispered confidences, the small inconsistencies that hinted at larger truths. She penned a brief acceptance note and rang for her maid to post it, then returned to her knitting, her thoughts drifting like autumn leaves toward the aviary and its feathered inhabitants. Little did she know that the party would unveil not just the beauty of exotic birds, but the darker plumage of deceit hidden in plain sight. Chapter 2. Guests and Whispers. The day of the garden party dawned bright and clear, with a sky of unblemished blue that seemed to promise nothing but pleasantries and light-hearted conversation. Elmwood Manor's lawns stretched out like a verdant carpet, meticulously mowed by Mr. Wilkins the gardener, who had risen at first light to ensure every blade of grass aligned with his exacting standards. Tables draped in crisp white linen dotted the expanse, each bearing silver trays of delicacies, dainty cucumber sandwiches with the crusts neatly trimmed, scones fresh from the oven and accompanied by clotted cream and strawberry jam, and an assortment of petits fours that gleamed like jewels under the sun. A marquee tent had been erected near the rose garden, its flaps tied back to allow the gentle breeze to circulate, carrying with it the mingled scents of blooming flowers and freshly brewed tea. Lady Evelyn Hargrove, the hostess, moved among the preparations with the grace of a woman accustomed to command. She was a tall figure, her posture erect from years of riding to hounds and attending formal dinners, dressed in a gown of soft lavender silk that whispered against the grass as she walked. Around her neck hung the sapphire pendant, its deep blue stone catching the light and throwing tiny sparks of brilliance onto her collarbone. It was a piece that drew the eye, not merely for its beauty, but for the stories that clung to it like invisible threads, tales of exotic origins and whispered superstitions. Lady Hargrove touched it absently from time to time, as if reassuring herself of its presence, a habit that spoke volumes to those who observed such things. The guests began to arrive shortly after noon, their carriages and motor cars crunching along the gravel drive that wound up from the village road. First came the vicar, Reverend Harold Thompson, a man of middle years with a face as mild and unassuming as the sermons he delivered each Sunday. He stepped down from his bicycle, for he disdained modern transport, claiming it distracted from contemplation, with a basket of wild flowers he had gathered that morning. "For your table, Lady Hargrove," he said, presenting them with a bow that was both courteous and slightly awkward, as if he were unused to such worldly gestures. The vicar was a widower, his wife having passed some 10 years prior from a lingering illness, and since then he had devoted himself to his parish with a quiet zeal. He was fond of birds, he confided to his hostess, as she led him toward the refreshment table, having kept a modest aviary of his own in his youth. "Though nothing so grand as yours, of course," he added hastily, his cheeks coloring faintly under her appreciative gaze. Following closely behind was young Dr. Reginald Ellis, the village physician, who arrived in a smart little Austin motor car that he drove with the confidence of a man who knew his worth. At 32, he was considered quite the catch by the local matrons, with his dark hair neatly pomaded and his eyes holding a sparkle of good humor. He greeted Lady Hargrove with a firm handshake and a compliment on her appearance that bordered on the flirtatious, though delivered with such professional charm that it could not offend. "You look the picture of health, my lady," he said, his voice carrying the faint trace of a London accent from his medical school days. Dr. Ellis had settled in St. Mary Mead only 3 years ago, taking over the practice from old Dr. Haydock, who had retired to the seaside. He was known for his attentiveness to his patients, particularly the female ones, and there were rumors, always whispered, never confirmed, of a broken engagement in his past that had left him wary of commitment. Today he seemed in high spirits, accepting a cup of tea and engaging the vicar in a discussion about the merits of herbal remedies versus modern pharmaceuticals. Not far behind came Miss Lydia Finch, the proprietress of the village post office, a woman whose sharp tongue was as legendary as her efficiency in sorting mail. She arrived on foot, her sensible shoes clicking purposefully along the path, dressed in a tweed suit that might have been fashionable 2 decades earlier, but now served as armor against the world's follies. Miss Finch was a spinster by choice, or so she proclaimed, having turned down at least one proposal in her youth from a traveling salesman who, in her opinion, lacked sufficient backbone. Her face was angular, with eyes that missed nothing, and she carried a parasol that she wielded like a scepter. "Lady Hargrove," she said upon arrival, her voice carrying across the lawn, "I trust this affair won't be disrupted by any of those pesky journalists from the city. I heard one was sniffing about the village yesterday." Lady Hargrove laughed lightly, assuring her that the party was strictly local, but Miss Finch's comment lingered, a small seed of unease planted amid the festivities. As more guests trickled in, the local squire and his wife, a pair of elderly sisters from the neighboring estate, and a handful of farmers' wives eager for a glimpse of grandeur, the atmosphere grew lively. Laughter mingled with the clink of china, and the air hummed with conversations that flitted from the weather to the latest village scandals. Lady Hargrove circulated tirelessly, her effusive charm drawing smiles from even the most reserved attendees. She had a way of making each person feel uniquely valued, a skill honed from years as a colonel's wife in far-flung postings where diplomacy was as essential as dinner parties. Among the staff, who moved discreetly in the background, was Clara Benson, the young maid who had been in Lady Hargrove's employ for just over a year. At 20, Clara was a slight figure with mousy brown hair pinned back under a crisp white cap, her eyes large and often downcast, as if she preferred the shadows to the spotlight. She carried trays of refreshments with a quiet efficiency, her movements precise but unassuming. Clara had come to Elmwood from a nearby orphanage, recommended by the vicar himself, and while she was diligent in her duties, there was about her an air of quiet reserve that bordered on secrecy. She spoke little, answering questions with monosyllables, and avoided eye contact with the guests, particularly the men. Dr. Ellis, ever the observer, noticed her once as she refilled his teacup and attempted a kindly remark. "You must be kept busy with all this, Miss Benson." Clara murmured something indistinct and hurried away, her cheeks flushing. It was amid this gathering that whispers began to circulate about the recent mishap in the aviary. Earlier that week, a decoy bird, a cleverly crafted wooden finch painted with lifelike precision to mimic the real specimens, had vanished from its perch. The aviary door had been found slightly ajar one morning, with no sign of forced entry. And though a search of the grounds turned up nothing, the incident had set tongues wagging in the village. Some, like Miss Finch, joked that the place was bewitched, recalling old legends of the manor being built on ancient fairy rings. "Mark my words," she said to the squire's wife, her voice low but audible. "It's a sign of trouble. Things don't just disappear into thin air." Others, more practical, attributed it to a faulty latch or perhaps a mischievous child from the village, though Lady Hargrove herself dismissed such notions with a wave of her hand. "A simple oversight," she declared to a group clustered near the marquee. "The wind must have nudged the door open, and the decoy rolled away. We'll find it soon enough." But the whispers persisted, weaving through the crowd like invisible threads. Reverend Thompson, overhearing Miss Finch's comment, shook his head gently. "We mustn't give credence to superstitions," he admonished. "It's likely just a prank. The youth of today—" He trailed off, his mild eyes scanning the lawn as if expecting to spot the culprit among the guests. Dr. Ellis, joining the conversation, offered a more scientific perspective. "Perhaps one of the real birds mistook it for a rival and knocked it down," he suggested with a chuckle. "I've read about such behaviors in ornithological journals. Territorial instincts can be quite fierce." His words drew nods from some, but Miss Finch remained unconvinced, her lips pursing in that familiar expression of skepticism. As the afternoon wore on, the sun climbed higher, casting a golden glow over the proceedings. Children from the village, invited for the occasion, played games on the far edge of the lawn, their laughter a counterpoint to the adult murmurs. Lady Hargrove, ever the gracious host, organized a small croquet match, pairing guests in unlikely combinations that sparked new alliances and rivalries. The vicar proved surprisingly adept with the mallet, scoring points with a precision that belied his clerical demeanor, while Dr. Ellis gallantly allowed his partner, one of the elderly sisters, to claim victory in their round. Clara, meanwhile, continued her rounds, her tray growing lighter as sandwiches disappeared. She paused once near the aviary's edge, her gaze lingering on the glass dome, where the birds fluttered in colorful bursts. The structure was a marvel, its iron framework curving elegantly to enclose a miniature jungle of ferns and flowering plants. Inside, the finches darted from branch to branch, their songs a melodic backdrop to the party. The decoy's absence was not visible from afar, but those who knew of it couldn't help but glance toward the spot where it had sat, a silent sentinel among the living creatures. It was during a lull in the croquet that the whispers grew bolder. Miss Finch, sipping her tea under the marquee, leaned toward the squire's wife. "You know, I heard from Mrs. Price Ridley that Lady Hargrove has been consulting with solicitors lately. Financial matters, they say. Perhaps the decoy was sold off quietly." The squire's wife gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Surely not. The Hargroves have always been above such things." But the seed was planted, and soon the rumor rippled outward, reaching even the vicar's ears. He frowned, adjusting his clerical collar. "Idle talk," he murmured to Dr. Ellis. "We must remember charity in our judgments." Dr. Ellis nodded, though his mind wandered to his recent visits to the manor. Lady Hargrove had indeed seemed preoccupied during a routine checkup the previous month, complaining of headaches that he attributed to strain. "The upkeep of a place like this must be enormous," he replied thoughtfully, "especially with the colonel gone." The two men fell silent, watching as Lady Hargrove approached, her pendant swinging gently with each step. She seemed oblivious to the undercurrents, her laughter ringing out as she complimented a guest on her hat. Yet, for all the surface gaiety, there was an intangible tension in the air, as if the vanished decoy were a harbinger of greater mysteries. Clara, clearing empty plates nearby, overheard snippets of the conversation and bit her lip, her hands trembling slightly on the tray. She hurried back to the kitchen, where the cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Baxter, scolded her for dawdling. "Mind your step, girl. We don't need any accidents today." As the clock in the manor's tower chimed 3, the party reached its zenith. Guests strolled the paths, admiring the rose bushes heavy with blooms, and some ventured closer to the aviary, peering through the glass at the exotic inhabitants. The parakeets, with their vibrant greens and blues, chattered noisily, mimicking fragments of human speech that drew delighted exclamations. "How clever they are!" exclaimed one of the farmers' wives. "Almost like little people." Lady Hargrove, sensing the interest, announced an impromptu tour. "Come, everyone," she called, her voice carrying across the lawn. "Let me show you my feathered friends properly." The group gathered, following her toward the dome, where Mr. Wilkins stood ready with the key to the padlock, a sturdy brass affair that secured the door against intruders. He was a man of few words, his face weathered from years outdoors, his hands calloused and stained with earth. "All in order, ma'am," he grunted, unlocking the mechanism with a click. Inside, the air was warm and humid, scented with the earthy tang of soil and the sweet nectar of flowers. The birds fluttered more energetically at the intrusion, their wings a blur of color. Lady Hargrove pointed out favorites, a scarlet macaw that had been a gift from her husband, a cluster of canaries singing in harmony. "And here," she said, gesturing to an empty perch, "is where the decoy sat. Such a pity it's gone. It was so realistic, carved by a craftsman in India." The guests murmured sympathetically, though Miss Finch's eyes narrowed speculatively. Dr. Ellis, standing near the back, noticed Clara hovering outside the door, her expression unreadable. He wondered idly about her background. The orphanage life must have been harsh, fostering that habitual reticence. The vicar, meanwhile, clasped his hands in admiration. "A true Eden," he pronounced, "God's creatures in all their glory." As the tour concluded and the group dispersed back to the lawns, the whispers resumed with renewed vigor. The decoy's escape, once a minor anecdote, now loomed larger in the collective imagination, a puzzle that begged for solution. Little did the guests know that this seemingly trivial incident was but the prelude to a far more bewildering disappearance, one that would draw even the astute Miss Marple into its web. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the grass, and the party continued under the canopy of golden leaves that rustled softly in the breeze. Tea was replenished, conversations deepened, and alliances formed in the subtle dance of social interaction. Lady Hargrove, her pendant still gleaming, moved among her guests with unflagging energy, unaware that eyes, curious, envious, calculating, followed its sparkle. Clara, returning with a fresh platter of scones, paused to adjust her cap, her gaze flicking toward the aviary once more. In that moment, her face betrayed a flicker of something deeper, worry, perhaps, or calculation. But it passed quickly, lost amid the chatter, as the afternoon unfolded in deceptive tranquility. Chapter 3. The Aviary's Allure. The golden afternoon at Elmwood Manor unfolded with the languid grace of a summer dream, the air thick with the scent of roses and the hum of contented voices. The garden party, now in full swing, had settled into a rhythm of polite conversation and gentle laughter, punctuated by the occasional clink of teacups and the distant trill of Lady Hargrove's exotic birds. The sun, high in a cloudless sky, bathed the lawns in a warm glow, casting dappled shadows through the ancient oaks that framed the estate. Guests wandered, in small clusters, some admiring the manicured flower beds, others lingering near the refreshment tables, where Mrs. Baxter's lemon tarts were fast disappearing. Lady Evelyn Hargrove, ever the consummate hostess, flitted among her guests with an air of practiced ease, her lavender gown a soft contrast to the vibrant greens of the garden. The sapphire pendant at her throat gleamed with every turn of her head, drawing admiring glances and, perhaps, less innocent ones. She was in her element, her voice bright as she regaled a group of village matrons with tales of her late husband's travels in the Orient, where he had acquired many of the aviary's prized inhabitants. The colonel was quite taken with the parakeets, she said, her eyes sparkling with reminiscence. He claimed their chatter reminded him of regimental dinners, full of gossip and bravado. Not far from this circle, near a cluster of hydrangeas, sat Miss Jane Marple, who had arrived somewhat later than the other guests, her wicker chair positioned to afford a clear view of the gathering. Her knitting needles moved with quiet precision, a soft gray shawl taking shape in her lap, though her eyes were far from idle. They darted about the scene, noting the small interactions that others might overlook, the way Reverend Thompson's fingers twitched nervously when Miss Finch spoke too loudly, or how Dr. Ellis's charming smile lingered a fraction too long on the younger ladies. Miss Marple had a way of seeing the world as a tapestry of human motives, each thread revealing a story if one knew where to look. The centerpiece of the afternoon, as promised in the invitation, was the aviary itself, a magnificent structure of wrought iron and thick glass, its dome catching the sunlight like a giant prism. It stood at the edge of the lawn, surrounded by a low hedge of boxwood, its interior a lush tableau of tropical ferns and cascading vines. The birds within fluttered in bursts of color: scarlet macaws, emerald parakeets, and delicate finches from distant shores, their songs weaving a melody that seemed to belong to another world. The aviary was secured by a single door, its heavy brass padlock gleaming with the polish of recent attention. Only Lady Hargrove and Mr. Wilkins, the gardener, knew the combination, a fact she had mentioned more than once, with a touch of pride, as if it underscored the sanctity of her feathered sanctuary. As the clock neared 4, Lady Hargrove clapped her hands, her voice cutting through the hum of conversation. "My dear friends," she called, "I invite you all to join me for a tour of the aviary. You must see the birds in their full splendor." The announcement was met with murmurs of delight, and the guests began to drift toward the glass house, their curiosity piqued. The vicar, Reverend Thompson, adjusted his spectacles and followed eagerly, his earlier conversation about his own modest bird-keeping days still fresh in his mind. Dr. Ellis, ever gallant, offered his arm to one of the elderly sisters from the neighboring estate, who accepted with a flustered giggle. Miss Finch, parasol in hand, strode purposefully ahead, her sharp eyes already scanning the structure for anything amiss. Miss Marple, however, remained in her chair, her knitting needles pausing as she observed the procession. She had intended to join the tour, but something, a faint instinct honed by years of quiet observation, prompted her to linger. From her vantage point, she could see the aviary's entrance and the guests filing through, as well as the staff hovering at the edges of the scene. Clara Benson, the young maid, was there, standing just outside the hedge, her hands clasped tightly before her. She seemed to be watching the aviary with an intensity that struck Miss Marple as peculiar, though the girl's face was as unreadable as ever. Nearby, Mr. Wilkins leaned against a rake, his weathered features set in their usual scowl, though his eyes followed Clara for a moment before returning to the ground. Inside the aviary, the air was warm and heavy, scented with the loamy richness of soil and the sweet tang of flowering plants. Lady Hargrove led the group along a narrow path lined with pebbles, pointing out the various species with the enthusiasm of a collector. "This is our blue-throated macaw," she said, gesturing to a bird perched high on a branch, its feathers of vivid turquoise. "A gift from a merchant in Bombay. And here, these tiny finches, Gouldian from Australia, are quite rare. Their colors change with the light, you know." The guests oohed and awed, their voices mingling with the birds' chatter, creating a symphony of sound that echoed off the glass walls. The aviary's interior was a marvel of design, its iron framework supporting shelves of potted plants and artificial nests crafted to mimic the birds' natural habitats. A small fountain bubbled at the center, its gentle splash adding to the illusion of a tropical oasis. On a pedestal nearby stood a velvet box, its lid open to reveal a nest of silk where Lady Hargrove occasionally placed her pendant for safekeeping during such events, a precaution born of a near theft years ago at a London soiree. Today, however, the pendant remained at her throat, its sapphire catching the light as she moved. As the tour progressed, the guests' attention was drawn to an empty perch near the fountain, where the missing decoy bird, a wooden finch carved with exquisite detail, had once sat. Lady Hargrove paused before it, her smile faltering for a moment. "Such a pity about our little decoy," she said, her voice light but tinged with irritation. "It was a clever thing, painted to look just like the real finches. I suppose it was misplaced during the cleaning last week." She waved a hand dismissively, but the guests exchanged glances, the earlier whispers about the bewitched aviary resurfacing in their minds. Reverend Thompson, Ever, the peacemaker, offered a gentle comment. "Perhaps it will turn up yet, Lady Hargrove. Things have a way of coming back to their rightful place." His words were meant to soothe, but Miss Finch, standing nearby, gave a small huff. "If you ask me," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard, "it's odd that only the decoy vanished and none of the real birds. Sounds like someone knew what they were doing." Her remark drew a few raised eyebrows, but Lady Hargrove laughed it off, steering the group toward a cluster of canaries to change the subject. Outside, Miss Marple's attention was caught by a brief exchange near the aviary's entrance. Clara, still lingering by the hedge, had been approached by Dr. Ellis, who seemed to have slipped away from the tour. He leaned toward her, his voice low but audible to Miss Marple's sharp ears. "You look troubled, Miss Benson," he said kindly. "Is it the birds? I heard you were fond of them." Clara's response was barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the ground. "They're nice, sir. I just feed them is all." She stepped back, clutching her apron, and Dr. Ellis, sensing her discomfort, returned to the aviary with a thoughtful frown. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her mind was elsewhere. She recalled a similar incident from her youth, when a neighbor's prized brooch had gone missing during a village fete, only to be found tucked inside a flower pot. A childish prank, or so it seemed, until the culprit's deeper motives came to light. Clara's demeanor, that flicker of unease, reminded her of something, though she couldn't yet place it. "People are so like themselves," she murmured, her voice lost in the breeze. The tour concluded, and the guests spilled back onto the lawn, their chatter animated by the spectacle they had witnessed. Lady Hargrove, ever attentive, called for more tea and directed Mr. Wilkins to open another bottle of sherry for those inclined toward stronger refreshment. The gardener complied with a grunt, his movements slow but deliberate, as if he resented the interruption to his usual solitude. Clara, meanwhile, resumed her duties, carrying a tray of crystal glasses that sparkled in the sunlight, her steps careful, but her expression distant. As the afternoon wore on, the mood remained festive, yet Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of restlessness among the guests. The decoy's disappearance, though trivial in itself, had stirred something, a ripple of curiosity that bordered on suspicion. Miss Finch, now seated near the marquee, was holding court with a small group, her voice low but insistent. "I'm telling you, there's more to this than meets the eye," she said, her parasol tapping the ground for emphasis. "A wooden bird doesn't just walk away. Someone took it, and I'd wager they had a reason." The squire's wife, listening intently, nodded, her eyes darting toward the aviary, as if expecting to see the decoy reappear. Reverend Thompson, overhearing, attempted to steer the conversation elsewhere. "Let us not leap to conclusions," he said mildly. "It may simply have been misplaced during the aviary's restoration. These things happen." But his words lacked conviction, and even he glanced toward the glass dome with a touch of unease. Dr. Ellis, meanwhile, had taken up a position near the croquet lawn, where a new game was starting. He joined in, his laughter ringing out as he coached the elderly sisters, who wielded their mallets with more enthusiasm than skill. Yet his eyes occasionally strayed to the aviary, and once or twice Miss Marple noticed him watching Clara as she moved among the guests. There was no flirtation in his gaze, only a physician's curiosity, perhaps, or something deeper she couldn't yet discern. The aviary itself stood serene, its glass walls reflecting the shifting light as clouds began to drift across the sky. Inside, the birds continued their dance, oblivious to the human dramas unfolding outside. The padlock, gleaming on the door, seemed to mock the idea of intrusion, its digits undisturbed since Mr. Wilkins had opened it for the tour. Yet Miss Marple, watching from her chair, couldn't shake the feeling that the aviary held secrets beyond its feathered inhabitants. She thought of the decoy bird, its absence a puzzle that seemed to resonate with the village's love of minor mysteries. In her experience, such trifles were rarely as innocent as they appeared. She recalled a case in her niece's village where a missing silver spoon had unraveled a web of jealousy among the household staff. "It's always the small things," she mused, her needles clicking softly. "They point to the larger ones, if one knows how to look." As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn, Lady Hargrove announced that tea would be served again, this time with a selection of fruitcakes and pastries. The guests rallied, their spirits buoyed by the prospect of more indulgence, and the party continued its gentle course. Clara moved silently among them, her tray steady, her eyes averted. Mr. Wilkins returned to his rake, muttering about the roses needing attention, and Miss Marple, knitting quietly, watched it all, her mind piecing together the fragments of a story that had yet to fully unfold. The aviary, with its allure of beauty and mystery, stood as a silent witness to the gathering, its glass walls hiding truths that would soon demand to be revealed. For now, though, the afternoon was still young, and the guests were blissfully unaware of the shadow that would soon fall over Elmwood Manor. Chapter 4. The Vanishing Jewel. The sun had begun its gradual descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. Yet the garden party at Elmwood Manor showed no signs of waning. Laughter echoed across the lawns, mingling with the soft strains of a gramophone that Lady Hargrove had set up near the marquee, its melodies drifting like a gentle undercurrent beneath the conversations. Guests milled about in contented groups, some engaged in animated discussions about the latest London fashions, others savoring the last of Mrs. Baxter's exquisite pastries. The air was alive with the buzz of social harmony, a tableau of English countryside leisure that seemed impervious to disruption. Lady Evelyn Hargrove, her cheeks flushed from the warmth of the day and the exertions of hosting, paused amid a cluster of admirers near the rose arbor. She had just finished recounting a particularly amusing anecdote from her husband's days in India, involving a mischievous monkey and a misplaced monocle, which had elicited chuckles from the vicar and a delighted gasp from the squire's wife. Touching the sapphire pendant at her throat, a gesture that had become almost reflexive, she glanced toward the manor house, its stone facade glowing in the late light. "If you'll excuse me for a moment, dear friends," she said, her voice carrying that blend of apology and authority that marked her breeding. "I must freshen up before the evening chill sets in. Do carry on. The sherry is excellent, and I believe there's more croquet to be played." With nods and smiles from her companions, she made her way across the lawn, her lavender gown swishing softly against the grass. As she passed the aviary, its glass dome now shimmering with reflected sunset colors. An impulse seized her. The pendant, heavy with its stone and history, felt suddenly cumbersome against her skin, warmed by the afternoon's exertions. Recalling a near mishap at a previous gathering, where a brooch had slipped unnoticed into the folds of a shawl, she decided on her customary precaution. The aviary, with its secure padlock, had served as an impromptu safe on more than one occasion, visible yet protected, a clever hiding spot in plain sight. Approaching the door, she glanced about to ensure no one was watching too closely. Mr. Wilkins was occupied trimming a distant hedge, his back turned, while Clara Benson busied herself clearing plates near the marquee. Satisfied, Lady Hargrove dialed the combination, a sequence of digits derived from her wedding date, known only to herself and the gardener, and the lock clicked open with a satisfying snap. Stepping inside, she was enveloped once more by the humid warmth and the chorus of bird calls, the finches darting in flashes of color overhead. She crossed to the central pedestal, a marble affair adorned with carved vines, and lifted the lid of the small velvet box nestled there. With care, she unclasped the pendant, placing it within the silk-lined interior, where it nestled like a captured star. Closing the box, she patted it once, then exited, relocking the door with a firm twist. The aviary stood undisturbed, its contents safe, or so she believed. Returning to the manor, Lady Hargrove ascended the grand staircase to her boudoir, a room of faded elegance, with chintz curtains and a dressing table cluttered with silver-backed brushes and perfume bottles. She splashed cool water on her face, reapplied a touch of powder, and adjusted her hair, all the while humming a snippet of the gramophone's tune. The party below called to her, a symphony of voices that promised continued delight. Descending once more, she rejoined her guests, her absence noted only by a few, who welcomed her back with compliments on her refreshed appearance. An hour slipped by in the pleasant haze of late afternoon. The croquet game had resumed with renewed vigor, Doctor. Ellis partnering with Miss Finch in a match that drew spectators for its unlikely pairing, the doctor's easy charm contrasting with the postmistress's competitive edge. Reverend Thompson stood by, offering mild encouragement, while the elderly sisters from the neighboring estate sipped sherry and reminisced about bygone parties. Miss Marple, still in her wicker chair, observed it all with her customary acuity, her knitting progressing steadily. She noted how Lady Hargrove, now sans pendant, moved with a lighter step, engaging in conversation with the farmers' wives about the merits of hybrid roses. It was Clara who first disrupted the idyll, though unwittingly. Carrying a tray of empty glasses back toward the kitchen, she passed near the aviary and paused, her gaze drawn to the glass walls. Something, a glint, or perhaps the absence of one, caught her eye. She set down the tray on a nearby bench and approached, peering through the panes. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp that nonetheless carried across the lawn. "Oh no," she murmured, her voice trembling. Turning, she hurried toward Lady Hargrove, who was laughing at a jest from the squire. "Ma'am," Clara said, her face pale, "you'd best come quick. The aviary. Something's wrong." Lady Hargrove's laughter faded, replaced by a frown of concern. "Wrong? What do you mean, girl?" But Clara only shook her head, gesturing urgently. Intrigued and mildly annoyed, Lady Hargrove excused herself once more and followed the maid, a small entourage forming in her wake. Dr. Ellis, ever attentive, and Miss Finch, whose curiosity was piqued. Miss Marple, sensing the shift in atmosphere, set aside her knitting and rose, joining the group at a discreet distance. At the aviary door, Lady Hargrove dialed the combination again, her fingers steady despite the growing unease. The lock opened without resistance, and she pushed inside, the others crowding at the threshold. Her eyes went immediately to the pedestal, the velvet box still there, lid closed. With a relieved sigh, she lifted it, but as she opened the lid, a scream tore from her lips, a sharp, piercing sound that silenced the birds and drew every head on the lawn. The box was empty. The sapphire pendant, her cherished heirloom, had vanished. Chaos ensued in the moments that followed. Guests rushed toward the aviary, murmurs swelling into exclamations of shock. "Stolen!" someone cried. But how? The door was locked. Lady Hargrove clutched the empty box to her chest, her face ashen, tears welling in her eyes. "My pendant, it's gone. Who could have done this?" Dr. Ellis stepped forward, his medical instincts kicking in, guiding her to a nearby bench and pressing a glass of water into her hands. "Breathe deeply, Lady Hargrove. We'll sort this out." Reverend Thompson, his mild features creased with worry, offered words of comfort. "A dreadful thing, but perhaps it's merely misplaced. Let us search calmly." But Miss Finch, pushing her way inside, surveyed the scene with her sharp gaze. "Misplaced? Nonsense! Look at this mess." She pointed to the floor, where feathers lay scattered in disarray. Plucked from the finches, it seemed, forming erratic patterns near the pedestal. The air inside felt disturbed, as if a whirlwind had passed through, though the birds now huddled quietly on their perches, their eyes beady with alarm. Mr. Wilkins, summoned by the commotion, arrived puffing, his rake abandoned. "What's all this?" he demanded, his gruff voice cutting through the babble. Informed of the theft, he scratched his head, peering at the padlock that now hung open. "Door was secure, ma'am. I checked it myself after the tour." Lady Hargrove, regaining some composure, nodded. "Yes, and I locked it after placing the pendant inside. No one else knows the combination." Yet as Dr. Ellis examined the padlock more closely, his brow furrowed. "Wait a moment. Look here." He pointed to the digits where faint marks suggested tampering, small indentations around the wheels, as if a tool had been used to probe or force them. "Someone's been at this," he said gravely. "Not broken, but meddled with." The revelation sent a ripple through the crowd. Who could have done such a thing? And how, in the midst of a party, without being seen? Miss Marple, who had slipped inside unobserved, knelt carefully to inspect the feathers. They were not merely fallen, but strewn, some crushed as if underfoot, others arranged in a trail leading from the door to the pedestal. "Interesting," she murmured, her voice soft amid the clamor. She noted the absence of footprints in the soft earth of the aviary floor, disturbed only by the recent influx of guests, and the intact glass panels, showing no signs of breakage or forced entry. The door, too, bore no marks beyond the padlock's subtle tampering. Speculation erupted like fireworks. Miss Finch, ever the voice of suspicion, turned to Clara. "You were the one who noticed it first, girl. What were you doing lurking about?" Clara flushed, her hands twisting in her apron. "Just passing by, miss. I saw the box through the glass. It looked wrong, somehow." Mr. Wilkins grunted. "She's always feeding the birds, has access, she does." But Clara protested, her voice quavering. "I didn't touch nothing, I swear." Lady Hargrove, supported by the vicar, rose unsteadily. We must call the constable. Sergeant Hayes. He'll know what to do." A messenger was dispatched to the village, and in the interim, the party dissolved into uneasy knots of conversation. Guests whispered theories. A daring thief from outside, perhaps, scaling the hedge under cover of the croquet game, or an insider familiar with the manor's routines. The decoy bird's earlier disappearance was invoked anew, now seen as an ominous precursor. "First the wooden finch, now the jewel," the squire's wife said, her eyes wide. "It's as if the aviary is cursed." Dr. Ellis, taking charge in the absence of authority, suggested cordoning off the aviary to preserve the scene. "No one in or out until the sergeant arrives," he declared, his tone firm. Reverend Thompson nodded approval, while Miss Finch hovered, her parasol now a tool for pointing out potential clues, a stray thread on the pedestal, a smudge on the glass. Miss Marple, retreating to her chair, resumed her knitting with apparent calm, but her mind raced. The vanishing jewel reminded her of a long-ago incident at a country house weekend, where a diamond ring had disappeared from a locked drawer, only to reveal a tale of desperation and deceit. "People don't change," she thought, her eyes scanning the faces around her. Lady Hargrove's distress seemed genuine, her hands trembling as she described the pendant's history to the gathering crowd. Clara's pallor suggested fear, but of what? Guilt or merely the shock of accusation? Mr. Wilkins's defensiveness hinted at hidden resentments, perhaps over wages or slights. As the sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows that stretched like accusing fingers across the lawn, the atmosphere shifted from festivity to foreboding. The gramophone wound down, its music replaced by hushed tones and the occasional sob from Lady Hargrove. Guests began to depart in twos and threes, offering condolences and promises to assist in any way, though their eyes held the gleam of impending gossip. The village would buzz with this for weeks. Sergeant Hayes arrived at last, his bicycle propped against the gate, his uniform slightly askew from the hasty ride. A sturdy man with a mustache like a hedgehog, he listened to the accounts with methodical nods, notebook in hand. "Locked, you say? And tampered digits?" He examined the padlock, confirming the marks, then surveyed the scattered feathers. "Looks like a scuffle, but with what? The birds?" He chuckled dryly, but his eyes were sharp. Interviews commenced informally, the sergeant questioning Lady Hargrove first, then the staff. Clara repeated her story, tears streaking her cheeks, while Mr. Wilkins bristled at implications of negligence. Dr. Ellis provided a timeline, his observations precise, and Reverend Thompson vouched for the general goodwill of the gathering. Miss Finch offered unsolicited theories, pointing fingers at vague outsiders, while the remaining guests corroborated the sequence of events. Miss Marple approached last, shared her quiet insights, the feather's deliberate arrangement, the lack of external signs of entry. "It's all very neat," she said mildly, "almost too neat." The sergeant raised an eyebrow, but noted her words. As twilight enveloped the manor, lanterns were lit, casting flickering light on the aviary's glass. The jewel remained missing, a void that echoed through the estate. Lady Hargrove retired indoors, attended by her cook, while the others dispersed, the party a memory tainted by loss. Miss Marple, walking homeward under the stars, pondered the puzzle. The vanishing jewel was no mere theft. It was a statement, a carefully orchestrated illusion. And in the quiet of St. Mary Mead, such illusions had a way of unraveling under the right gaze. Chapter 5. Alarms and Accusations. The golden afternoon at Elmwood Manor, so recently bathed in the soft glow of autumnal sunlight, had taken a sharp turn toward disquiet. The theft of Lady Hargrove's sapphire pendant had cast a pall over the garden party, transforming the cheerful chatter into a hum of suspicion and unease. The air, once fragrant with roses and freshly cut grass, now seemed heavy with unspoken accusations. Guests hovered near the aviary, their eyes darting between the glass dome and one another, as if the culprit might reveal themselves through a guilty glance. Lady Hargrove, her lavender gown slightly crumpled from her distress, stood at the center of the gathering, her hands clasped tightly as she awaited the arrival of Sergeant Hayes, the local constable. The aviary itself, that splendid structure of Victorian ironwork and polished glass, stood as a silent witness to the crime. Its heavy padlock, gleaming under the sun, bore faint scratches around the digits, marks that suggested tampering, yet it had opened smoothly with Lady Hargrove's combination. The interior, a riot of color from the fluttering finches and parakeets, was now marred by a scattering of feathers, some delicate and natural, others oddly synthetic, as if plucked from a decoy. The velvet box that had held the pendant lay empty on its pedestal, a mute testament to the audacity of the theft. No footprints disturbed the soft earth outside, and the glass panels showed no signs of being forced. It was, as Reverend Thompson remarked in his gentle, bewildered tone, a most perplexing puzzle. Sergeant Hayes arrived promptly, his bicycle rattling up the gravel drive, his helmet slightly askew from the haste of his journey. A sturdy man in his late 30s, with a ruddy complexion and a mustache that seemed to bristle with authority, he was known in St. Mary Mead for his methodical approach, if not for an overabundance of imagination. He dismounted, adjusted his uniform, and strode toward the aviary, notebook in hand. The guests parted to let him through, their murmurs falling silent as he surveyed the scene. "Lady Hargrove," he began, his voice carrying a note of deference tempered by professional resolve, "if you'd be so kind as to recount the events once more." "Ma'am." Lady Hargrove, her composure fraying like the hem of an old shawl, obliged. "I placed the pendant in the velvet box, as I often do when I step away during such gatherings," she said, her voice trembling. "The aviary is secure, you see. The combination known only to myself and Mr. Wilkins, my gardener. I locked it myself, I'm certain of it. Yet when I returned, the box was empty, and these feathers were everywhere." She gestured toward the aviary floor, her sapphireless neck looking oddly bare without its accustomed adornment. Sergeant Hayes nodded, scribbling in his notebook. He approached the aviary door, examining the padlock with a squint. The scratches were faint but undeniable, a series of fine gouges around the digits, as if someone had probed with a tool not quite suited to the task. He tested the lock, entering Lady Hargrove's combination, 7294, and it clicked open with a satisfying snap. "No sign of it being forced," he muttered, more to himself than to the onlookers. Whoever did this knew the code or was uncommonly lucky. The crowd stirred, a ripple of unease passing through them. Miss Lydia Finch, her thin lips pursed, folded her arms and remarked, "Luck, Sergeant? I'd wager it's cunning. Someone here has sticky fingers, mark my words." Her eyes swept over the assembled guests, lingering briefly on Clara Benson, the maid, who stood at the edge of the group, her face pale and her hands twisting in her apron. Clara, sensing the scrutiny, flushed and lowered her gaze. "I didn't touch it, miss," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "I fed the birds this morning, as I always do, and locked the door after. I swear it." Sergeant Hayes turned to her, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. "And you saw nothing unusual, Miss Benson? No one lingering near the aviary?" Clara shook her head, her dark curls bobbing. "No, sir. I was busy with the trays and such. I didn't see anyone go near it." Mr. Wilkins, the gardener, stepped forward, his weathered face creased with indignation. "If you're looking for a culprit, Sergeant, you'd do well to check the tool shed. I've got no reason to meddle with her ladyship's jewels. I'm out here pruning roses, not picking locks." His tone was gruff, but there was a defensive edge to it, as if he sensed the weight of suspicion settling on his broad shoulders. "Tools, you say?" Sergeant Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Might be worth a look. Anyone else have access to the shed?" "Clara borrows things now and then," Mr. Wilkins said quickly, his eyes flicking toward the maid. "For cleaning or what have you, I don't keep track." Clara's flush deepened, and she opened her mouth to protest, but Lady Hargrove interjected. "Let's not leap to conclusions," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Clara has been with us for years. She's a good girl, if a bit quiet." Reverend Thompson, ever the peacemaker, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we might pause for a moment of reflection," he suggested, his hands clasped before him. "This is a distressing matter, but accusations without evidence serve only to cloud the truth. Shall we pray for clarity?" Miss Finch snorted softly. "Prayers won't bring back that sapphire, Reverend. Someone's got it, and they're standing among us, I'd wager." Dr. Ellis, who had been observing the proceedings with a clinical detachment, stepped forward. "If I may, Sergeant, the aviary's design is worth considering. The glass is thick, the door robust. A thief would need either the combination or a key to a lockpick's art, and those scratches suggest the latter. But why leave the box behind? It's almost as if they wanted us to know it was taken." Sergeant Hayes nodded, jotting down the observation. "A fair point, Doctor. And these feathers, odd, aren't they? Some look like they belong to the birds, but others—" He picked up a synthetic feather, its painted sheen catching the light. "This one's from that decoy bird, the one that went missing earlier this week. Curious, that." The mention of the decoy bird stirred a fresh wave of whispers. Lady Hargrove frowned, her fingers brushing her throat where the pendant should have been. "That wretched thing," she said. "I thought it was a prank, or perhaps a fault in the latch, but to think it might be connected." Sergeant Hayes turned to Mr. Wilkins. "You were here when the decoy vanished, weren't you? Anything to add?" The gardener shrugged, his hands thrust into his pockets. "I told her ladyship then. It was likely a loose latch. The birds didn't escape, so I figured it wasn't worth fussing over. I was wrong, maybe." The constable's gaze lingered on him, then shifted to the other guests. "Anyone else notice anything peculiar today? Or in the days leading up to this?" The group exchanged glances, but no one spoke. The silence was broken by the distant chime of the village clock, marking the hour. Sergeant Hayes closed his notebook with a snap. "Right then, I'll need to speak with each of you privately. Lady Hargrove, may we use the drawing room?" "Of course," she replied, her voice faint. "Anything to resolve this." As the guests began to disperse, some lingering to whisper among themselves, Sergeant Hayes beckoned Mr. Wilkins to follow him to the tool shed. The gardener complied, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The shed, a small wooden structure tucked behind a row of yew hedges, was cluttered with spades, shears, and a jumble of smaller tools. Hayes examined the contents, his eyes narrowing as he lifted a small screwdriver, its tip slightly worn and scratched. "This yours?" he asked, holding it up. Mr. Wilkins shook his head. "Could be anyone's. I don't mark my tools, but Clara's been in here, like I said." Hayes slipped the screwdriver into a handkerchief and tucked it into his pocket. "We'll see what it tells us," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of its significance. Back at the aviary, the remaining guests milled about, their earlier gaiety replaced by a tense curiosity. Miss Finch, never one to shy away from speculation, cornered Dr. Ellis near a rosebush. "You're a clever man, Doctor," she said, her voice low. "What do you make of it? A maid with debts, a gardener with a grudge, or something else entirely?" Dr. Ellis adjusted his glasses, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I'm a physician, Miss Finch, not a detective, but if I were to guess, I'd say the truth lies in what we're not seeing. The pendant didn't sprout wings, after all." Miss Finch's eyes gleamed. "Exactly. And those feathers, why scatter them? It's theatrical, don't you think? Like someone's trying to distract us." Meanwhile, Clara had retreated to the edge of the lawn, her hands still twisting in her apron. She glanced toward the aviary, her expression a mix of fear and something else. Resignation, perhaps. Lady Hargrove, noticing her distress, approached her. "Clara, my dear, you're not yourself. Is there something you haven't told us?" The maid shook her head vehemently. "No, my lady, I couldn't." Her words faltered, and she turned away, her shoulders trembling. Lady Hargrove sighed, her own nerves frayed. "Very well, but you must speak to Sergeant Hayes. Honesty is the best course." As the constable began his interviews in the drawing room, the atmosphere at Elmwood Manor grew thicker with suspicion. Each guest, when questioned, offered little beyond vague impressions and alibis. Reverend Thompson spoke of Christian charity and the fallibility of human nature, but admitted to noticing nothing amiss. Dr. Ellis recounted his movements, mingling with guests, admiring the aviary, but had no clear view of the door during the critical hour. Miss Finch, with her usual bluntness, suggested that Lady Hargrove's habit of flaunting her jewels invited trouble, a remark that earned her a sharp look from the hostess. Mr. Wilkins, when pressed, grew surly. "I've worked here 20 years, he said, his voice rough. "If I wanted to steal, I'd have done it long before now. Besides, I was out by the rose beds. Ask anyone." Clara's interview was the most strained. She repeated her story, feeding the birds, locking the door, returning to her duties, but her voice quavered, and her eyes darted to the floor. Sergeant Hayes, noting her discomfort, asked about the screwdriver. "Ever seen it before, Miss Benson?" I might have," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I borrowed a tool once or twice for fixing a loose hinge in the kitchen, but I put it back." Hayes leaned forward, his mustache twitching. "And you're certain you locked the aviary this morning?" "Yes, sir," she said, her hands clenched. "I always do." The interviews yielded no immediate answers, but the screwdriver and the scratches on the padlock gnawed at Sergeant Hayes. He returned to the aviary, examining the pedestal where the velvet box had rested. The fountain nearby gurgled softly, its spray catching the fading light. He knelt, inspecting the floor for anything overlooked, a stray feather, a scuff mark, but found nothing new. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn, the guests began to depart, their farewells subdued. Lady Hargrove stood at the manor's entrance, her face pale but resolute, thanking each for their attendance despite the day's calamity. Sergeant Hayes lingered, promising to return the next morning with fresh eyes. In the quiet that followed, the aviary stood as a sentinel, its glass walls reflecting the first stars. The birds within, oblivious to the human drama, chirped softly, their wings rustling against the artificial nests. Somewhere among them, or perhaps hidden in plain sight, lay the key to the mystery, a truth that, for now, remained as elusive as the bewitched decoy that had set the stage for the theft. Chapter 6. Miss Marple's Arrival. The twilight had settled over St. Mary Mead like a soft velvet curtain, casting Elmwood Manor in a hush that contrasted sharply with the afternoon's clamor. The garden party, so recently a scene of conviviality, had dissolved into a tangle of suspicion following the theft of Lady Hargrove's sapphire pendant. The manor's elegant facade, with its ivy-clad walls and glowing windows, seemed to guard its secrets as the last guests departed, their footsteps fading along the gravel drive. It was at this delicate hour, when the village was settling into its evening rituals, that Miss Jane Marple's modest figure appeared at the manor's gate, her knitting bag swinging gently from her arm. Word of the theft had reached her cottage as she sipped her afternoon tea, relayed by Mrs. Bantry, a neighbor with a penchant for breathless gossip. The tale of the vanished pendant, the locked aviary, and the scattered feathers had piqued Miss Marple's curiosity, not because of the jewel's value, but because of the human intricacies it suggested. "People are so very predictable," she had murmured to herself, setting down her teacup. A locked door and a missing trinket always hide a story. With her usual unhurried grace, she had donned her coat, pinned her hat, and made her way to Elmwood Manor, her keen eyes bright with anticipation. Lady Hargrove, still shaken, greeted her old acquaintance at the door with a mixture of relief and desperation. Her lavender gown was now slightly wilted, and her hands fluttered nervously as she ushered Miss Marple into the drawing-room. "Oh, Jane, thank heavens you're here," she said, her voice quivering like a plucked violin string. "It's simply dreadful. My pendant, gone, and not a soul can say how. The constable's been poking about, but I fear he's as baffled as the rest of us." Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she drew out a half-finished scarf. "Now, Evelyn, do start at the beginning," she said, her tone soothing but firm. "Tell me everything, and leave nothing out, no matter how trivial it seems." Lady Hargrove recounted the day's events with tearful precision. The garden party's cheerful bustle, the tour of the aviary, her decision to lock the pendant in the velvet box, and the shocking discovery of its absence. She described the padlock's scratches, the scattered feathers, and the empty box, her words tumbling over one another in her agitation. "I can't fathom it, Jane," she concluded, wringing her hands. "The door was locked, the combination unchanged. It's as if the pendant vanished into thin air." Miss Marple listened patiently, her eyes darting about the room, taking in the polished mahogany furniture, the delicate porcelain figurines, and the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hostess. She noted the slight tremor in Lady Hargrove's voice, the way her fingers lingered on her throat where the pendant once hung. "Most intriguing," she murmured, her needles pausing. "And this decoy bird, the one that escaped earlier this week, tell me more about that." Lady Hargrove frowned, as if the mention of the decoy were an unwelcome distraction. "Oh, that tiresome thing, a wooden finch, painted to look real, used to train the birds or deter predators. It vanished from its perch last Tuesday, and the door was found ajar. I thought it a prank, or perhaps Mr. Wilkins forgot to lock up properly. No real birds escaped, so I didn't dwell on it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression inscrutable. "And the aviary itself, only you and Mr. Wilkins know the combination?" "Yes, and I change it regularly," Lady Hargrove replied. "It's been 7294 since last month. I trust Mr. Wilkins implicitly. He's been with us for years." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "Trust is a fine thing, Evelyn, but human nature is a curious beast. May I see the aviary?" The two women made their way to the garden, where the glass-domed structure gleamed under the rising moon. Sergeant Hayes, who had lingered to make further notes, joined them, his mustache twitching with curiosity at Miss Marple's arrival. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his helmet, "heard you've a knack for untangling knots like these." "I merely observe, Sergeant," she replied with a modest smile. "People are much like my knitting. Pull one thread, and the pattern reveals itself." The aviary door was unlocked with Lady Hargrove's combination, and Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes scanning the interior. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of feathers and damp earth. The finches and parakeets flitted among the ferns, their colors muted in the dim light. The pedestal stood at the center, its velvet box still empty, and the fountain gurgled softly nearby. Miss Marple knelt, her fingers brushing the floor where the feathers lay scattered, most natural, but one or two distinctly artificial, their painted sheen catching the lantern's glow. "These feathers," she said, holding up a synthetic one. "From the decoy, I presume?" Sergeant Hayes nodded. "So it seems. Found a few like it near the pedestal. Odd, though. No bird could scatter them so widely." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed, birds are not so theatrical, are they?" She moved to the pedestal, examining its smooth surface, then peered at the padlock still hanging from the door. The scratches, faint but deliberate, suggested an amateur's hand, someone unfamiliar with lock-picking, perhaps, or someone wishing to create the impression of it. "Human nature is so predictable," she murmured, almost to herself. "Like the villagers in my youth, who hid sweets in plain sight, thinking no one would notice." Sergeant Hayes raised an eyebrow. "You think the thief meant for us to see these scratches?" "I think," Miss Marple said, straightening, "that people often reveal more than they intend. May I speak with the staff and guests, Sergeant? A few questions might shed light." "Of course," he replied, though his tone suggested he doubted anyone could unravel the mystery so easily. He led her back to the manor, where the remaining guests and staff had gathered in the drawing room, their faces a study in varied emotions, curiosity, unease, and in some cases, barely concealed irritation. Miss Marple settled into her armchair once more, her knitting bag at her side. She began with Clara Benson, the maid, whose pale face and fidgeting hands betrayed her nerves. "Clara, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you fed the birds this morning. I understand. Did you notice anything unusual in the aviary?" Clara's eyes flicked toward the floor. "No, miss, just the birds, same as always. I locked the door after like I'm supposed to." "And the decoy bird's escape last week. Were you there when it happened?" Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting in her apron. I was cleaning nearby, miss. Mr. Wilkins said the latch was loose, but I didn't see nothing myself." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but probing. "You seem troubled, Clara. Is there something you'd like to share?" The maid shook her head, her voice barely audible. "No, miss. I just want this all to be over." Next, Miss Marple turned to Mr. Wilkins, who stood by the fireplace, his soil-stained hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Wilkins," she said, "you've worked here many years, I gather. The aviary is your domain, in a manner of speaking. What do you make of this decoy business?" The gardener's face darkened. "A fool thing, if you ask me. Someone left the door open or the latch stuck. I told her ladyship it weren't worth fussing over. I've enough to do without chasing wooden birds." "And the pendant?" Miss Marple pressed. "You were near the roses all afternoon, you said?" "Aye," he replied, his tone gruff. "Ask anyone. I don't meddle with jewels." Miss Lydia Finch, seated on a sofa with her arms crossed, interjected before Miss Marple could continue. "If you ask me, Jane, this whole affair smells of desperation. Lady Hargrove's been short of funds lately. Everyone knows it. What if she staged the theft for insurance? It's been done before." Lady Hargrove gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Lydia, how dare you? That pendant was my husband's gift, a family heirloom. I'd sooner sell the manor than part with it." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "Let us not leap to conclusions, Miss Finch. Motives are like threads, tangled until you follow them to the source." She turned to Dr. Ellis, who leaned against a bookcase, his expression one of detached amusement. "Doctor, you were among the guests all afternoon. Did you notice anyone near the aviary during Lady Hargrove's absence?" Dr. Ellis adjusted his glasses, his smile faint. "I'm afraid I was too busy charming the vicar's wife with tales of tropical diseases. The aviary was a popular spot, but I didn't see anyone loitering by the door. Mind you, those feathers are curious. A bird carrying off a pendant seems fanciful, but stranger things have happened." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Stranger things, indeed. And you, Reverend Thompson? Your thoughts?" The vicar, seated near the window, looked up from his clasped hands. "I confess, Miss Marple, I was lost in admiration of the gardens. Such beauty is a gift, even in troubled times. But I did overhear Clara speaking to Dr. Ellis about the decoy earlier. She seemed quite upset about it." Clara's head snapped up, her cheeks flushing. "I only said it was odd, sir. I didn't mean nothing by it." Miss Marple's smile was gentle but unwavering. "No one's accusing you, my dear, but small details, like dropped stitches, can unravel a pattern." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "What strikes me is the timing. The decoy's escape, the scratches on the lock, the scattered feathers, all seem designed to distract. Yet the pendant was taken with precision from a locked aviary. Someone here is cleverer than they appear." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the group. Sergeant Hayes, who had been listening intently, cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, you've a way of making things sound simpler than they are, but we've no proof, no witnesses. What's your next step?" Miss Marple folded her knitting and rose, her small frame radiating quiet authority. "I should like to see the tool shed, Sergeant, and perhaps the aviary again by morning light. Shadows hide much, but daylight reveals more." As the group dispersed, Lady Hargrove lingered, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face. "Do you think you can find it, Jane? My pendant. It means more than I can say." Miss Marple patted her hand. "I shall do my best, Evelyn. People, like birds, leave traces. We need only follow them." The manor settled into an uneasy quiet, the aviary's glass walls reflecting the starlit sky. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind turning over the day's events like a skein of wool. The scratches, the feathers, the decoy's curious disappearance, all pointed to a plan, one woven with care but fraying at the edges. As she sat by her fire, her needles clicking, she thought of a girl in her village long ago who hid a stolen brooch in a bird's nest, thinking no one would look there. "Human nature," she murmured, "never changes." Chapter 7. Clues in the Feathers. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a gentle clarity, bathing Elmwood Manor's gardens in a golden haze that softened the edges of the previous day's turmoil. The air carried the crisp bite of autumn, mingled with the faint sweetness of late blooming roses. The manor itself, though still grand, seemed to wear a mantle of unease, its windows reflecting the light with a guarded air. The theft of Lady Hargrove's sapphire pendant had left a ripple of disquiet, and the aviary, once a jewel in the estate's crown, now stood as a silent enigma, its glass walls guarding secrets yet to be unraveled. Miss Jane Marple, having returned to the manor at Lady Hargrove's earnest request, stepped lightly across the dew-kissed lawn, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. Her eyes, sharp as ever despite her years, scanned the surroundings with a quiet intensity. She had spent the previous evening by her cottage fire, her needles clicking as her mind sifted through the details of the garden party, the whispers, the alibis, the scattered feathers. "People are so like their own shadows," she had mused to herself, always trailing behind, revealing more than they know. Now, in the clear light of morning, she was determined to follow those shadows to their source. Sergeant Hayes met her at the aviary, his mustache neatly trimmed, but his expression weary. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his helmet. "Back to poke about, are we?" "I've gone over the place twice already, but I'll admit I'm stumped." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking softly as she paused by the aviary door. "Patience, Sergeant, is a great revealer of truths. May we go inside?" The constable unlocked the door with Lady Hargrove's combination, and they stepped into the warm, fragrant interior. The finches and parakeets fluttered among the ferns, their chirps a lively counterpoint to the stillness of the scene. The pedestal stood at the center, its empty velvet box a stark reminder of the theft. The floor was still littered with feathers, a mix of natural and synthetic, their haphazard arrangement suggesting a hurried act. Miss Marple knelt carefully, her gloved fingers brushing the feathers. She picked up a synthetic one, its painted surface gleaming unnaturally. "These decoy feathers are most curious," she said, turning it over in her hand. "They seem to have been scattered deliberately, don't you think?" Sergeant Hayes frowned, crouching beside her. "Deliberately? You mean to make it look like a bird caused a fuss?" "Perhaps," she replied, her eyes scanning the floor, "or to distract from something else." She followed the trail of feathers, which led to an empty nest box tucked among the foliage. The box, a small wooden structure designed for the birds, was slightly ajar, its interior dark and uninviting. Miss Marple peered inside, her brow furrowing. "This nest box is empty, Sergeant. Was it always so?" Hayes scratched his head. "Can't say I noticed, but the birds use them for nesting, not much else." "Why?" Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. In my village, years ago, a child hid a stolen apple in a birdhouse, thinking it safe. People often choose hiding places that feel familiar. She straightened, her gaze returning to the pedestal. The pendant was taken from this box, yet the box itself was left behind. A thief in a hurry might have taken both, unless the box was meant to be found. The constable's eyes narrowed. "You're saying the thief wanted us to know the pendant was gone?" "It's possible," she said, her tone mild, but her eyes sharp. "The scratches on the padlock, too. Rather clumsy for a skilled lockpick, don't you think?" Hayes examined the padlock, its faint gouges catching the light. "Amateur work, I'd say, but the lock wasn't broken. It opened with her ladyship's code." Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm, which suggests either knowledge of the combination or a clever ruse. "Tell me, Sergeant, have you found anything else in the tool shed?" Hayes produced the small screwdriver from his pocket, wrapped in a handkerchief. "This, found it yesterday. Tip scratched, matches the marks on the lock. Wilkins says it's not his, but Clara admitted to borrowing tools before." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Clara, yes, a nervous girl, but perhaps more observant than she seems. I should like to speak with her again, and the others. Small threads, Sergeant, lead to the whole cloth. They returned to the manor, where Lady Hargrove had gathered the key figures in the drawing room. The atmosphere was taut, the previous day's conviviality replaced by a strained civility. Clara Benson stood by the tea tray, her hands trembling as she poured. Mr. Wilkins leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his weathered face set in a scowl. Miss Lydia Finch sat primly on a sofa, her sharp eyes darting between faces. Dr. Ellis lounged by a window, his expression one of detached curiosity, while Reverend Thompson clasped his hands, his mild demeanor a calming presence. Lady Hargrove, seated in a high-backed chair, looked pale but composed. "Jane, have you found anything?" she asked, her voice tinged with hope. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting bag at her feet. "A few threads, Evelyn, but the pattern is not yet clear. Let us begin with the nest box. Clara, you tend the aviary daily. Was that particular nest box empty before the party?" Clara's cup rattled against its saucer. I think so, miss. I don't always check every box. The birds move about, you see." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze gentle but probing. "Of course. And the decoy feathers. Do you recall seeing them before the theft?" Clara's cheeks flushed. "No, miss. I saw the decoy bird last week, but not the feathers. Not until after." Mr. Wilkins snorted. "Sounds like someone's covering their tracks. I told you, Sergeant, check the girl's story. She's always skulking about." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't do it, sir. I swear." Now, Reverend Thompson interjected softly. "Let us not judge hastily. The truth will come to light." Miss Finch's lips curled. "Truth, Reverend. The truth is someone here's a thief, and I'd wager it's not one of the birds." Dr. Ellis chuckled, earning a glare from Lady Hargrove. "Forgive me," he said, adjusting his glasses. "But Miss Finch has a point. The feathers are a theatrical touch, almost too obvious. A bird stealing a pendant is absurd, but the idea might have been planted to mislead us." Miss Marple's needles paused. "A theatrical touch, indeed, like a play I once saw in London, where the villain scattered clues to confuse the hero. Mr. Wilkins, you mentioned a loose latch last week. Did you inspect it yourself?" The gardener shifted uncomfortably. I did. It was stiff, but not broken. I figured the wind or a clumsy hand left it open." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A clumsy hand, perhaps, or a careful one. Sergeant, might we examine the latch now? Hayes led the group to the aviary, where Miss Marple inspected the door's latch. It was a sturdy mechanism, but the catch showed faint signs of wear, as if it had been manipulated. Not forced, she murmured, but perhaps loosened deliberately. A rehearsal, one might say. Rehearsal? Lady Hargrove's voice was sharp. You mean someone planned this? Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. People often practice their misdeeds, Evelyn, like children learning a new game. The decoy's escape feels like a trial run. The group returned to the drawing room, the weight of her words settling over them. Miss Marple turned to Dr. Ellis. Doctor, you suggested a bird might have taken the pendant, however fancifully. Have you any other theories? Dr. Ellis shrugged, his smile wry. I'm no detective, Miss Marple, but the locked door suggests an inside job, someone with access, or someone clever enough to fake it. Miss Finch leaned forward. Clara's got access, and she's been jumpy as a cat. And those tools, Wilkins said she borrowed them. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her face. I borrowed a hammer once for a shelf, but I put it back. Mr. Wilkins glared. She's always poking about the shed, and she's got debts. Everyone knows her mother's ill. Enough, Lady Hargrove snapped. Clara's been loyal. I won't have her slandered without proof. Miss Marple's voice was calm. Proof is what we seek, Evelyn. Clara, tell me, when you fed the birds yesterday, did you see anyone near the aviary? Clara shook her head, her voice trembling. No, miss, I was alone. I locked up and went straight to the kitchen. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the screwdriver in Hayes's hand. Sergeant, have you tested this tool for fingerprints? Hayes blinked. Not yet, Miss Marple. I'll send it to the station, but it's been handled, likely smudged. A pity, she said softly. Fingerprints are like signatures, so very telling. Reverend, you mentioned Clara's upset about the decoy. What exactly did she say? Reverend Thompson hesitated, his kindly face troubled. She said it was strange, that's all. She seemed anxious, as if it bothered her more than it should. Clara's eyes widened. It was just odd, sir. A wooden bird, gone like that. I thought maybe someone was playing a trick. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Tricks, like lies, have a way of unraveling. The feathers, the scratches, the latch, all pieces of a puzzle. But puzzles, you see, always have a picture, even if it's hidden. The room grew quiet, each person lost in thought. Sergeant Hayes cleared his throat. Miss Marple, you've got a theory, haven't you? I have observations, she corrected gently. Theories require proof, and we are not there yet. But I wonder, why leave the box? Why scatter feathers? It's as if the thief wished to tell a story. Lady Hargrove's voice was faint. What kind of story, Jane? Miss Marple's eyes softened. The kind that distracts from the truth. Evelyn, like a magpie stealing shiny things, the thief wants us to look elsewhere. The morning wore on, and Miss Marple requested a walk through the gardens, accompanied by Hayes and Lady Hargrove. They paused by the tool shed, where Miss Marple examined the door, noting its loose hinges. Careless maintenance, she remarked, or convenient access. Hayes frowned. You think someone tampered with it? I think, she said, that opportunity is often disguised as chance. We shall see. As they returned to the manor, Miss Marple's mind was busy, weaving together the threads of the case, the feathers, the lock, the decoy's escape. All pointed to a deliberate act, a performance designed to mislead. She thought of a young woman in her village years ago who had staged a theft to cover a debt, her guilt betrayed by a single careless detail. "Human nature," she murmured, "is the true bewitched birdcage, locking us all in patterns we cannot escape." The manor awaited her return, its secrets simmering beneath the surface, ready to be plucked like feathers from a nest. Chapter 8. Shadows of the Past. As evening draped its dusky veil over Elmwood Manor, the grand estate seemed to retreat into a brooding silence, its windows glowing like wary eyes against the gathering dark. The theft of Lady Hargrove's sapphire pendant had cast a long shadow over the previous day's garden party, transforming its festive air into a mire of suspicion. The aviary, with its glittering glass dome and restless birds, stood as a mute sentinel, its secrets locked within as tightly as the padlock that had failed to protect the jewel. Inside the manor, the drawing room was a stage for quiet tensions, where guests and staff alike awaited the next act in this unfolding drama. Miss Jane Marple, having spent the morning examining the aviary and questioning the key figures, had returned to the manor as the sun dipped low, her knitting bag a constant companion. Her presence, unassuming yet commanding, drew eyes as she settled into a plush armchair, her needles clicking with a rhythm that seemed to steady the room's nervous pulse. The fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the scent of sherry mingled with the faint mustiness of old books, creating an atmosphere ripe for revelations. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as the needles in her hands, was busy untangling the threads of the case, the scattered feathers, the scratched padlock, the vanished decoy bird, all pointing to a pattern she was beginning to discern. Lady Hargrove, her composure fraying like a worn tapestry, poured sherry for the gathered company, her movements jerky. "Jane, you've been so kind to take an interest," she said, her voice tinged with both gratitude and exhaustion. "But I fear this business will ruin me. The pendant, it's not just its value, but what it meant to my late husband." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her gaze remained keen. "Sentiment, Evelyn, is a powerful motive, for good or ill. Let us gather everyone and see what the evening reveals. Shadows, you know, often hide the truth in plain sight." Sergeant Hayes, standing by the mantel, nodded. "I've questioned them all, Miss Marple, but I'll admit I'm no closer to an answer. A fresh round of talk might shake something loose." The drawing room soon filled with the familiar faces. Clara Benson, the maid, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands clasped tightly. Mr. Wilkins, the gardener, his weathered face set in a scowl. Miss Lydia Finch, her sharp tongue barely restrained. Dr. Ellis, his clinical detachment softened by curiosity, and Reverend Thompson, his mild demeanor a balm amid the tension. Lady Hargrove took her place near the fire, her lavender gown catching the light as she clutched her glass. Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but deliberate. "We are all agreed that the theft is puzzling. A locked aviary, a missing pendant, and those curious feathers. But puzzles, like my knitting, have a way of revealing their design when you tug the right thread. Let us consider the past, for it often casts light on the present." She turned to Reverend Thompson, whose hands were folded in his lap. "Reverend, you've lived in St. Mary Mead many years. You mentioned Clara's distress over the decoy's escape. Has she ever spoken of other troubles, perhaps something from her past?" The vicar hesitated, his kindly face troubled. Well, Miss Marple, I don't like to speak of private matters, but there was a small incident some months ago. Clara was caught taking a few trifles from the village shop. Nothing valuable, just a ribbon or two. She was terribly sorry, and the shopkeeper forgave her, but it caused a stir. Clara's head snapped up, her cheeks flaming. "It was a mistake, sir. I meant to pay, but my mother's been ill, and I was distracted. I've not touched a thing since." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes gentle but probing. "No one doubts your remorse, Clara, but distress can lead to desperate acts. Did you feel pressed, perhaps, by your mother's needs?" Clara's hands twisted in her apron. "I'd never steal from her ladyship. The pendant, it's worth more than I'd ever dream of. I just fed the birds and locked up, like always." Miss Finch snorted, her arms crossed. "A likely story. Debts make thieves, Clara, and everyone knows your mother's doctor bills are piling up." Lady Hargrove's voice was sharp. "Lydia, that's unkind. Clara's been with us for years. I won't have her accused without evidence." Miss Marple raised a hand, her gesture calming. "Evidence is what we seek, Evelyn. Let us not judge too hastily. Dr. Ellis, you mentioned treating Lady Hargrove for nerves after the decoy's escape. Was there anything else that struck you about that incident?" Dr. Ellis leaned back, his fingers steepled. "It was curious, I'll grant you. Lady Hargrove was quite upset, blamed vandals or a prankster. I prescribed a mild sedative, but she seemed convinced someone was testing her security. The decoy's loss was trivial, yet it rattled her more than I'd expect." Lady Hargrove nodded, her fingers brushing her throat. "It felt like a violation, Jane. The aviary is my sanctuary, and to think someone tampered with it." Her voice trailed off, her eyes distant. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Mr. Wilkins. "You were there when the decoy vanished, Mr. Wilkins. You suggested a loose latch, but could it have been deliberate?" The gardener's scowl deepened. "I've said it before. I checked the latch and it was stiff but not broken. If someone opened it, they did it quiet-like. I was tending the hedges, not watching the door every minute." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "Of course, but a gardener's eye is sharp, Mr. Wilkins. Did you notice anyone near the aviary that day?" Wilkins hesitated, his hands thrust into his pockets. "Can't say I did. Clara was about, cleaning or some such. Maybe she saw something." Clara's eyes widened. "I didn't. I was sweeping the terrace, nowhere near the aviary." Sergeant Hayes interjected, holding up the screwdriver from the tool shed. "This was found yesterday, Miss Marple. Tip scratched, matches the marks on the padlock. Clara, you admitted to borrowing tools. Ever use this one?" Clara's voice trembled. I might have, sir, for a loose hinge in the pantry, but I put it back, I swear." Miss Finch's lips curled. "Convenient that. A maid with debts, a screwdriver, and a locked door. It's not hard to see the picture." Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. "Pictures can deceive, Miss Finch. In my village, years ago, a young man was accused of theft because he was seen near a shop, but the real culprit was a friend who borrowed his coat. Let us consider all possibilities." She turned to Lady Hargrove. "Evelyn, you mentioned a past burglary attempt at the manor. Tell me about it." Lady Hargrove's hand tightened on her glass. "It was 3 years ago, before Clara's time. Someone tried to force a window in the library, but the alarm scared them off. Nothing was taken, but it left me wary. That's why I started locking my jewels in the aviary. It's the safest place on the estate." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And the decoy's escape. Did it remind you of that incident? Lady Hargrove frowned. Not at first, but now you mention it, yes. It felt like someone was testing my defenses again. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. A test indeed, like a child in my niece's household who lost a key to see if anyone noticed. The decoy's disappearance may have been a rehearsal, but for what? Dr. Ellis raised an eyebrow. You think the thief planned the theft in advance, Miss Marple? That's rather elaborate for a spur-of-the-moment grab. Not so elaborate, she replied, her tone mild. People often lay plans in plain sight, thinking their motives opaque. The feathers, for instance. Why scatter them? It's a flourish, like a stage magician's sleight of hand. Reverend Thompson cleared his throat. A distraction, perhaps, to make us think a bird was involved? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Precisely, Reverend. Distractions are the thief's ally, but distractions require opportunity, and opportunity requires access. She turned to Clara. Clara, when you fed the birds yesterday, did you enter the aviary alone? Clara nodded, her voice barely audible. Yes, miss. It's my job. No one else was there. And the pedestal, did you touch it? No, miss. I just filled the feeders and checked the water. Miss Marple's gaze softened. You're a good girl, Clara, but fear can cloud the truth. If there's anything you've not told us, now is the time. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. I've told you everything, miss. Miss Finch leaned forward, her voice cutting. Everything? I heard you were seen near the tool shed last week, Clara. What were you doing there? Clara's flush deepened. I was fetching a broom. The shed's not locked. Anyone could have gone in. Mr. Wilkins grunted. She's right about that. I don't lock it. Never needed to till now. Sergeant Hayes rubbed his chin. Miss Marple, you're hinting at something, aren't you? You think the decoy's escape and the theft are linked? I think, she said, her voice steady, that nothing in this affair is accidental. The decoy's disappearance, the scratches, the feathers, all are threads in a single tapestry. But whose hands wove it? The room fell silent, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Lady Hargrove's eyes searched Miss Marple's face. Jane, do you believe the pendant is still here, on the estate? Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. I believe, Evelyn, that jewels, like secrets, are rarely far from their owners. We need only look where the shadows fall. Sergeant Hayes cleared his throat. I'll check the aviary again tomorrow, Miss Marple. Maybe we missed something in the dark. A wise plan, she said, folding her knitting. But tonight, let us reflect. The past has a way of whispering its truths, if we listen. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes drifting to the window where the aviary's silhouette loomed against the starry sky. She thought of a scandal in her village years ago, where a stolen watch was hidden in a garden shed, its thief betrayed by a single careless remark. Shadows of the past, she murmured, always leave traces. The manor settled into an uneasy quiet, its inhabitants bound by suspicion and secrets, while Miss Marple's mind spun like her needles, weaving a pattern that grew clearer with each passing hour. Chapter 9. The Maid's Secret. The morning following the theft at Elmwood Manor dawned with a mist that clung to the gardens like a gossamer shroud, softening the outlines of the roses and lending the aviary's glass dome a ghostly sheen. St. Mary Mead, with its quiet lanes and tidy cottages, seemed to hold its breath, as if awaiting the resolution of the mystery that had stirred its tranquil heart. The theft of Lady Hargrove's sapphire pendant had become the talk of the village, whispered over teacups, and speculated upon in the post office, where Miss Lydia Finch held court with her sharp opinions. Yet within the manor's walls, the air was thick with unspoken tensions, each occupant a player in a drama that Miss Jane Marple was determined to unravel. Miss Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, had arrived early, her sensible shoes leaving faint prints in the dew as she crossed the lawn. The previous evening's conversations had left her with a sense of the threads converging, feathers, scratches, a missing decoy. But the pattern remained incomplete. Human nature, she had mused by her cottage fire the night before, is like a garden. It grows wild unless tended, and secrets like weeds take root in the quiet places. Now, as she approached the manor, her eyes were bright with purpose, ready to tug at those threads until the truth emerged. Lady Hargrove greeted her in the hall, her face pale but resolute, the absence of her cherished pendant of visible weight. "Jane, you're a godsend," she said, her voice trembling with hope. "Sergeant Hayes is in the aviary again, poking about, but I fear he's no closer to finding my sapphire. Have you any new thoughts?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but guarded. "Thoughts, Evelyn, are like stitches, useless until they form a pattern. Let us observe and listen. The truth is often in what goes unsaid." They found Sergeant Hayes in the aviary, his notebook open as he examined the pedestal where the velvet box still lay, empty and forlorn. The morning light filtered through the glass, casting dappled patterns on the floor where the feathers, natural and synthetic, remained scattered. The birds fluttered above, their chirps a lively contrast to the somber mood. Hayes looked up as Miss Marple entered, his mustache twitching with a mix of frustration and respect. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I've been over every inch of this place. No new clues, unless you count these blasted feathers." Miss Marple knelt, her fingers brushing a synthetic feather, its painted sheen catching the light. "They are telling, Sergeant," she said softly. "Not in their presence, but in their placement. Scattered so widely, yet no bird could do such a thing with precision." She rose, her eyes scanning the nest boxes along the aviary's walls. "Have you checked these thoroughly?" Hayes nodded. "All empty, save for twigs and such. The birds don't seem bothered at any rate." Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. "Birds are simple creatures, Sergeant. People, however, complicate matters. I should like to speak with Clara again. She's a nervous girl, and nerves often betray secrets." They returned to the manor, where Clara Benson was in the kitchen, her hands busy with a feather duster as she polished a silver tray. Her dark curls were tucked under a cap, but her eyes were red, as if she had slept poorly. When Miss Marple entered, followed by Lady Hargrove and Hayes, Clara started, the duster slipping from her grasp. "Oh, miss," she exclaimed, stooping to retrieve it. "I didn't see you there." Miss Marple's tone was kind but firm. "No need to be alarmed, Clara. I only wish to talk. You've been most helpful, but I sense there's something you've not shared. Tell me, how do you find working for Lady Hargrove?" Clara's hands fidgeted, her eyes flicking toward the aviary visible through the kitchen window. "It's good work, miss. Her ladyship's kind, though sometimes it's hard, with my mother being ill and all." Miss Marple nodded, settling into a chair, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Illness is a heavy burden, my dear. I recall a girl in my village, much like you, who felt pressed by family troubles. She made a mistake once, taking something small, thinking it would help. Does that sound familiar?" Clara's flush deepened, her voice barely audible. I know about the shop incident, miss, but I've not taken anything since, I swear. I'd never touch her ladyship's pendant. Lady Hargrove's expression softened. Clara, I believe you're a good girl, but if you know something, you must tell us. Clara's eyes darted to the floor. I don't, my lady. I fed the birds, locked the door, and that's all. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the girl's hands, which clutched the duster tightly. And the decoy's escape last week, did it trouble you as much as the vicar suggested? Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting the duster's feathers. It was strange, miss. A wooden bird, gone like that. I thought maybe someone was playing a trick, but I didn't see anything. I told Mr. Wilkins the latch felt stiff, but he said it was fine. Miss Marple's needles paused. Stiff, you say? Yet the door was ajar. Interesting. She turned to Hayes. Sergeant, the screwdriver you found. May I see it? Hayes produced the tool, still wrapped in his handkerchief. Its tip bore faint scratches, mirroring those on the padlock. Miss Marple examined it closely, her eyes narrowing. A small tool for a small task, she murmured. Clara, you mentioned borrowing tools for a pantry hinge. Was this one of them? Clara's voice trembled. I'm not sure, miss. They all look alike to me. I borrowed something from the shed, but I put it back. Hayes frowned. You're certain you returned it? Wilkins says the shed's a mess. Tools go missing all the time. Mr. Wilkins, who had entered the kitchen to fetch a glass of water, overheard and bristled. Don't pin this on me, Sergeant. I've said it before. Clara's been in and out of that shed. If anyone's hiding something, it's her. Clara's eyes filled with tears. I'm not hiding anything. I'd never steal from her ladyship. Miss Marple's voice was soothing. No one's accusing you, Clara. But secrets, like feathers, have a way of floating to the surface. Tell me, when you were in the aviary yesterday, did you notice the pedestal? Clara shook her head. No, miss, I don't go near it. It's for her ladyship's things. I just do my job. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Your job? Yes, and a fine job you do. But sometimes, in doing our duties, we see things we don't realize are important. Think carefully. Anything unusual? Even the smallest detail? Clara's brow furrowed, her gaze drifting to the window again. There was a shadow, maybe. When I was locking up, I thought I saw someone move near the hedges, but it was quick, and I was in a hurry. Hayes leaned forward. A shadow? Why didn't you mention this before? I wasn't sure, sir. Clara's voice cracked. It was just a moment, and with the party, I didn't think it mattered. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. Every moment matters, Clara. Like a stitch dropped in a scarf, it can unravel the whole. Thank you, my dear. They moved to the drawing room, where the other key figures had gathered. Miss Lydia Finch sat with her arms crossed, her expression one of barely concealed impatience. Dr. Ellis leaned against a bookcase, his glasses glinting as he observed the proceedings. Reverend Thompson, ever the peacemaker, offered a gentle smile, while Lady Hargrove hovered near the fire, her anxiety palpable. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting bag at her feet. We've learned much, but the heart of this matter lies in what we've overlooked, she said. Clara's shadow is a new thread, but let us weave in the old ones. Miss Finch, you've suggested Lady Hargrove's financial troubles as a motive. Have you heard anything specific? Miss Finch's lips curled. Only what the village whispers, Jane. Her ladyship's been selling off paintings, and the manor's upkeep isn't cheap. A stolen jewel, insured, could solve a lot of problems. Lady Hargrove's hand flew to her chest. That's outrageous. My finances are my own affair, and the pendant is irreplaceable. Miss Marple's tone was calm. Gossip, Miss Finch, is like a loose stitch, eye-catching but unreliable. Dr. Ellis, you've treated Lady Hargrove recently. Has she spoken of financial strain? Dr. Ellis adjusted his glasses, his smile wry. Not directly, but she's been under strain, as I mentioned. The decoy's escape upset her more than seemed warranted, almost as if she feared it was a warning. Miss Marple nodded. A warning, perhaps, or a test. Reverend, you've known the Manor's staff for years. Has Clara ever spoken of her mother's illness? Reverend Thompson's face softened. She has, poor girl. Her mother's been poorly for months, and the treatments are costly. Clara's devoted, but it's a heavy burden for a maid's wages. Clara, standing by the door, bit her lip, her eyes downcast. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her, then shifted to Wilkins. Mr. Wilkins, you've worked here long enough to know the Manor's routines. Has anyone else had access to the aviary key or combination? Wilkins shook his head. No one but me and her ladyship. The combinations changed regular, and I don't write it down. If someone got in, they either knew it or picked the lock. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Or created the appearance of picking it. The scratches are suggestive, but not conclusive. Sergeant, have you searched the grounds for other tools? Hayes nodded. I've got a man combing the hedges, but nothing yet. The screwdriver's our best lead, and it points to Clara. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her face. It doesn't. I'd never. Miss Marple raised a hand. Let us not rush to judgment. In my village, a young woman once hid a stolen ring in a flower pot, thinking it safe. Desperation makes us clever, but also careless. Clara, you mentioned a shadow. Can you describe it? Clara's voice was faint. It was tall, I think, moving quick, like they didn't want to be seen. But it was just a glance, miss. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A glance can be enough, like a girl in my niece's household who saw a shadow and thought it a ghost, but it was only a thief slipping away. The room grew quiet, the fire's crackle the only sound. Lady Hargrove's voice broke the silence. Jane, do you think the pendant's still here? I think, Miss Marple said, that secrets, like jewels, are often closer than we imagine. We need only look where the shadows linger. Hayes rubbed his chin. I'll search the grounds again, Miss Marple. Maybe that shadow left something behind. A wise plan, she said, folding her knitting. But let us also search the heart. Desperation, loyalty, fear, they all leave traces. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes drifting to the aviary's silhouette against the misty sky. She thought of a scandal in her village, where a maid hid a stolen brooch in a coal scuttle, her guilt betrayed by a nervous glance. The maid's secret, she murmured, is not always what it seems. The manor settled into a tense quiet, its secrets simmering, ready to surface like feathers caught in a breeze. Chapter 10. A Twist in the Tale. The mist that had cloaked Elmwood Manor at dawn had burned away by mid-morning, leaving the gardens bathed in a crisp autumn light that glinted off the aviary's glass dome. St. Mary Mead, with its quaint cottages and bustling gossip, hummed with speculation about the theft of Lady Hargrove's sapphire pendant, a mystery that had ensnared the village's imagination. Within the manor's walls, the atmosphere was taut, each glance and whisper heavy with unspoken suspicion. The aviary, once a symbol of Lady Hargrove's eccentricity, now stood as a puzzle box, its secrets locked within its iron and glass frame. Miss Jane Marple. Her knitting bag, a familiar weight on her arm, had returned to the manor with a quiet determination. The previous day's revelations, Clara's nervous glances, the scratched screwdriver, the shadow by the hedges, had woven a delicate web in her mind, one she was intent on untangling. People, she had mused over her morning tea, are like my scarves. They seem simple until you notice the knots. Her sharp eyes, undimmed by age, scanned the manor's grounds as she approached, noting the orderly flower beds and the faint footprints in the dew-soaked grass. Lady Hargrove met her at the entrance, her face etched with worry, the absence of her pendant a visible wound. "Jane, I scarcely slept," she confessed, her hands twisting together. "The thought that someone here betrayed me, it's unbearable. Have you any hope of finding my sapphire?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but resolute. "Hope, Evelyn, is a fine thing, but observation is better. Let us revisit the aviary and test a theory or two. The truth, you see, often hides in the simplest places." Sergeant Hayes joined them, his notebook tucked under his arm, his mustache bristling with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "Miss Marple, you've got a knack for this," he said, tipping his helmet. "I've searched the grounds again. Nothing new, but I'm willing to follow your lead." They made their way to the aviary, where the birds fluttered among the ferns, their colors vivid against the morning light. The pedestal stood at the center, its empty velvet box a silent accusation. The scattered feathers, natural and synthetic, still littered the floor, their arrangement a deliberate chaos. Miss Marple paused by the door, her eyes on the padlock, its faint scratches gleaming faintly. "Sergeant," she said, "I'd like to reenact the decoy's escape. Lady Hargrove, can you show us exactly what happened that day?" Lady Hargrove nodded, her movements hesitant. "It was last Tuesday," she began, unlocking the aviary with the combination 7294. "I came to check on the birds, as I often do. The decoy, a wooden finch, painted to look real, was on its perch near the fountain. I left for tea, and when I returned, the door was ajar, and the decoy was gone. No real birds escaped, which was odd." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly from her bag, a rhythm that seemed to anchor her thoughts. "Odd, indeed. And the latch, Mr. Wilkins said it was stiff?" "Yes," Lady Hargrove replied. "He checked it and found nothing broken, just loose. I thought it a prank, or perhaps my own carelessness." Miss Marple turned to the latch, examining its worn catch. "Not broken, but manipulated, perhaps," she murmured. She stepped inside, her eyes tracing the path from the door to the pedestal. "The decoy was on this perch?" She pointed to a small iron stand near the fountain. "Yes," Lady Hargrove confirmed. "It was secured with a clip, but it was gone, clip and all." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "A clip, you say, and no trace of it was found?" "None," Hayes interjected. "We searched the aviary and the grounds. It's as if it vanished." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Things don't vanish, Sergeant. They're moved. Let us consider the pedestal itself." She approached the pedestal, its smooth marble surface unmarred, save for the velvet box. Kneeling, she ran her fingers along its base, her touch deliberate. "In my niece's household," she said, "a child once hid a stolen coin in a vase with a false bottom. People choose hiding places they think secure." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "You think the pendant's in the pedestal?" "Not the pendant, perhaps," she replied, "but something. Look here." Her fingers found a subtle seam, barely visible, at the pedestal's base. With a gentle press, a small panel clicked open, revealing a shallow compartment meant for storing bird feed. It was empty, save for a single synthetic feather, its painted sheen unmistakable. Lady Hargrove gasped. "I'd forgotten that compartment. It's for seed, nothing more. Why would a feather be there?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A feather, Evelyn, is a clue when it's out of place. This one suggests someone knew the pedestal's secret." She straightened, her gaze sweeping the aviary. The decoy's escape was no accident. It was a rehearsal, a test to see if the door could be opened without suspicion. Hayes frowned, his notebook open. A rehearsal for the theft? But why leave the feather? "To mislead," Miss Marple said simply. "Like a girl in my village who scattered petals to cover her tracks after stealing a brooch. The thief wanted us to focus on the birds, not the pedestal." They returned to the manor, where the key figures had gathered in the drawing room. Clara Benson stood by the tea tray, her hands trembling as she poured. Mr. Wilkins leaned against the wall, his scowl deepening. Miss Lydia Finch sat with her arms crossed, her eyes sharp with suspicion. Dr. Ellis lounged by a window, his expression one of detached amusement, while Reverend Thompson offered a gentle nod, his presence a quiet anchor. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting bag at her feet. "We've learned much," she began, her voice calm but commanding. The decoy's escape was no mere prank. It was a carefully planned act, designed to test the aviary's security. The feather in the pedestal's compartment confirms it. Someone knew its secret and used it to their advantage. Clara's cup rattled, her eyes wide. "I didn't know about any compartment, miss. I swear." Miss Marple's tone was gentle. "No one's accusing you, Clara, but you saw a shadow that day, didn't you, near the hedges?" Clara nodded, her voice faint. "Yes, miss. It was quick, like I said. I thought it was nothing." Miss Finch snorted. "Nothing? A shadow, a screwdriver, and a missing jewel. It's clear enough who's to blame." Lady Hargrove's voice was sharp. "Lydia, enough. Clara's not a thief." Miss Marple raised a hand. "Let us not leap to conclusions. Mr. Wilkins, you've tended the aviary for years. Did you know of the pedestal's compartment?" Wilkins shifted uncomfortably. I knew. It's for feed, like her ladyship said. But I've not touched it in months. Too busy with the roses." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "And yet a feather was placed there, deliberately. Dr. Ellis, you suggested the theft was theatrical. Would you say the decoy's escape was part of the performance?" Dr. Ellis adjusted his glasses, his smile wry. "It's possible. The scattered feathers, the scratched lock, it's all rather staged, like a play meant to distract." Reverend Thompson cleared his throat. "A distraction from what, Miss Marple? The pendant's gone, after all." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "From the truth, Reverend. The decoy's escape ensured no one suspected the aviary's security until the theft occurred. The thief needed time to open the compartment, perhaps, or to plan their escape." Hayes leaned forward. "You're saying the thief used the decoy to practice?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "Like a boy in my village who lost a key to test a lock before stealing a watch. The decoy was a trial run, and the feather in the compartment a slip, a small mistake that betrays the plan." Lady Hargrove's voice trembled. "But who, Jane? Who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Someone desperate, perhaps, or someone clever enough to hide their desperation. Let us consider the screwdriver, Sergeant. Where was it found? In the tool shed, Hayes replied, producing the tool. Near a pile of rakes. Wilkins says it's not his, and Clara's not sure. Miss Marple examined the screwdriver, its scratched tip glinting. A common tool, but telling. The scratches on the padlock were deliberate, meant to suggest tampering, yet the lock opened with the combination. Why stage such a charade? Dr. Ellis raised an eyebrow. To make us think an outsider broke in? Miss Marple nodded. Or to distract from the real method. The combination was known to two people, Lady Hargrove and Mr. Wilkins, but combinations can be guessed or observed. Wilkins bristled. I've not told a soul, and I was nowhere near the aviary when the pendant went missing. Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. I believe you, Mr. Wilkins, but eyes are everywhere in a busy household. Clara, you're in the aviary daily. Have you ever seen anyone watching Lady Hargrove enter the combination? Clara's eyes widened. No, miss. I don't think so. I'm too busy with my work. Miss Marple's needles paused. Work can blind us to what's under our noses, like a maid in my niece's household who didn't notice her mistress's diary was missing until it was too late. The thief relied on that blindness. The room grew quiet, the weight of her words settling over the group. Hayes rubbed his chin. Miss Marple, you're building a case, aren't you? You think the thief's still here? I think, she said, that the pendant is closer than we imagine. The decoys escape, the feathers, the scratches, all are part of a story meant to mislead. But stories, like scarves, unravel when you find the loose end. Lady Hargrove's eyes searched Miss Marple's face. Jane, do you know where my pendant is? Miss Marple's expression was kind but guarded. I know where to look, Evelyn. The aviary holds more than birds. It holds the truth, if we can find it. Hayes cleared his throat. I'll search the pedestal again, Miss Marple. Maybe we missed something. A wise plan, she said, folding her knitting. But look beyond the obvious. The thief's mistake was in thinking their plan too clever, like a girl in my village who hid a stolen ring in a teapot, forgetting the lid was loose. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes drifting to the aviary's silhouette against the brightening sky. The decoy's escape, the hidden compartment, the shadow by the hedges, all pointed to a plan woven with care but fraying at the edges. She thought of a young man in her village who staged a theft to cover a debt, his guilt betrayed by a single careless act. A twist in the tale, she murmured, is only a twist until you see the thread. The manor buzzed with quiet anticipation, its secrets poised to unravel like feathers caught in a sudden breeze. Chapter 11. The Revelation. The late morning sun hung high over Elmwood Manor, casting a warm glow across the manicured lawns and illuminating the aviary's glass dome with a crystalline clarity. St. Mary Mead, ever a hub of whispered speculation, buzzed with tales of the stolen sapphire pendant, each villager adding their own flourish to the mystery. Within the manor's walls, the air was thick with anticipation, as if the very stones awaited the unraveling of the truth. The aviary, with its fluttering birds and silent pedestal, stood as the heart of the enigma, its secrets poised to be laid bare. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a familiar companion, stood in the drawing room, her slight figure commanding the attention of the assembled group. The previous day's investigations, the scattered feathers, the scratched padlock, the hidden compartment in the pedestal, had woven a tapestry of clues in her mind, each thread leading closer to the truth. People, she had reflected over her morning tea, are like my knitting. They think their patterns are hidden, but a single loose stitch reveals all. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, surveyed the room, ready to pull that final stitch. Lady Hargrove, her lavender, gown replaced by a somber gray, sat near the fire, her hands clasped tightly. "Jane, please," she said, her voice a mix of hope and dread. "Have you found my pendant? I can't bear this uncertainty any longer." Miss Marple's smile was gentle but resolute. "Patience, Evelyn. The truth, like a good scarf, takes time to weave. Let us gather everyone and see what the morning reveals." Sergeant Hayes, his notebook worn from constant use, stood by the door, his mustache twitching with anticipation. "Miss Marple, you've got something up your sleeve, haven't you? I've searched every nook, but I'm ready to hear your take." The drawing room filled with the familiar figures. Clara Benson, the maid, her face pale and her hands fidgeting. Mr. Wilkins, the gardener, his weathered features set in a defensive scowl. Miss Lydia Finch, her sharp eyes gleaming with curiosity. Dr. Ellis, his clinical detachment softened by intrigue. And Reverend Thompson, his mild presence a steadying force. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows that danced across the polished furniture, as if mirroring the shifting suspicions in the room. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she began. "We have a puzzle before us," she said, her voice calm but commanding. A sapphire pendant, stolen from a locked aviary, with no sign of forced entry. Scratched padlock, scattered feathers, a hidden compartment, and a decoy bird's curious escape. All pieces of a story designed to mislead. But stories, you see, have authors, and authors leave traces. Lady Hargrove leaned forward, her eyes wide. "You know who took it, Jane?" Miss Marple's needles paused. "I know the pattern, Evelyn. Let us unravel it together." She turned to the group, her gaze sweeping over each face. The decoy's escape last week was no accident. It was a rehearsal, a test to ensure the aviary could be opened without raising suspicion. The latch, described as stiff, was deliberately loosened, not broken, but manipulated to seem so. Hayes nodded, his pen poised. "You said as much yesterday, Miss Marple. The feather in the pedestal's compartment. Proof someone knew its secret." "Precisely," she said. The compartment, meant for bird feed, was a perfect hiding place. Small, unnoticed, yet accessible to someone familiar with the aviary's workings. The synthetic feather found there was a mistake, a slip that betrayed the plan. Clara's hands twisted in her apron, her voice trembling. "I didn't know about any compartment, miss. I swear I didn't." Miss Marple's tone was gentle. "I believe you didn't know, Clara, but you saw something, a shadow near the hedges, you said, a fleeting glimpse, yet it matters." Miss Finch snorted, her arms crossed. "A shadow? Convenient, that. Clara's got debts, a screwdriver, and access to the aviary. It's not hard to see who's guilty." "Lady," Hargrove's voice was sharp. "Lydia, that's unfair. Clara's been loyal for years." Miss Marple raised a hand, her gesture calming. "Let us not judge too hastily. The screwdriver, Sergeant, was a clever touch, its scratches matching the padlocks, suggesting tampering. Yet the lock opened with the combination, unchanged. Why stage such a charade?" Dr. Ellis adjusted his glasses, his smile faint. "To make us think an outsider broke in, perhaps? A distraction from the real method." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Exactly, Doctor. The scratches were deliberate, made not during the theft, but earlier, to create a false trail. The thief needed us to believe the lock was picked, when in truth, they knew the combination. Mr. Wilkins bristled, his hands thrust into his pockets. I've not told a soul that code, and I was by the roses all afternoon. Ask anyone. Miss Marple nodded. I don't doubt your whereabouts, Mr. Wilkins, but combinations can be observed or guessed by someone close to the routine. Her gaze shifted to Clara. Clara, you're in the aviary daily, feeding the birds. Have you ever seen Lady Hargrove enter the combination? Clara's cheeks flushed. I try not to look, miss. It's not my place, but sometimes I'm nearby when she opens the door. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. Of course, and sometimes, in our duties, we see more than we realize. Like a girl in my village who watched her mistress hide a key, not knowing it would lead to a theft. Reverend Thompson cleared his throat, his kindly face troubled. Miss Marple, you're suggesting someone watched Lady Hargrove closely. But who would dare? Someone desperate, Miss Marple said softly. Desperation, Reverend, makes us bold. Clara, your mother's illness has been a burden, hasn't it? You've spoken of her treatments, the costs mounting. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Yes, miss, but I'd never steal. I love working here. I'd never betray her ladyship. Miss Marple's voice was soothing. I believe you love your work, Clara, but love and need can pull in opposite directions. Tell me, when you saw that shadow, did it seem familiar? Clara hesitated, her hands trembling. I don't know, miss. It was tall, quick. I thought it was nothing, just my nerves. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Nerves can be truthful, Clara. Let us return to the decoy's escape. It was a test, but also a distraction. The thief used it to shift suspicion to the latch, away from their true plan. She turned to Hayes. Sergeant, have you searched Clara's quarters? Hayes blinked, caught off guard. Not yet, Miss Marple. I didn't want to upset her ladyship without cause. Lady Hargrove gasped. Jane, surely you don't think Clara? I think, Miss Marple interrupted gently, that we must look everywhere. Clara, will you permit a search? It's the quickest way to clear your name. Clara nodded, her voice barely audible. Yes, miss. I've nothing to hide. Hayes, with Lady Hargrove's reluctant approval, led a small party to Clara's room, a modest space above the servants' quarters. The room was tidy, with a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a single window overlooking the gardens. Miss Marple stood by as Hayes searched, her eyes scanning the room with quiet intensity. Under the bed, tucked in a small tin box, Hayes found a folded handkerchief. He opened it carefully, revealing a glint of blue, the sapphire pendant, its facets catching the light. Lady Hargrove gasped, her hand flying to her chest. My pendant! Clara, how could you? Clara's face crumpled, tears streaming. I didn't take it, my lady. I swear I didn't. Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. One moment, Evelyn. Sergeant, where exactly was the handkerchief? In this tin, Hayes said, holding up the box. Hidden under the bed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Hidden, yet found so easily, like a boy in my village who hid a stolen watch in a drawer, hoping it would be overlooked. Clara, did you place this here? No, miss, Clara sobbed. I've never seen that tin before. Miss Finch's voice was sharp. A likely story. She's caught red-handed, Jane. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Not quite, Miss Finch. The tin is new, its edges unblemished. Clara's room is tidy, her belongings worn. This feels placed. She turned to the group. The thief needed a scapegoat, someone whose circumstances made them vulnerable. Clara's debts, her access to the aviary, her nervous manner, all made her the perfect choice. Hayes frowned. "You're saying someone framed her?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said. The decoy's escape was the first act, loosening the latch to test the aviary's security. The scratches on the padlock were the second, made earlier to suggest tampering. The feathers, scattered during the theft, were the third, a flourish to imply a bird's frenzy. But the pendant was never meant to leave the estate. It was hidden, first in the pedestal's compartment, then moved to Clara's room when suspicion grew. Lady Hargrove's voice trembled. "But who, Jane? Who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, lingering on each face. Someone who knew the combination or watched it being entered. Someone who needed money but feared exposure. Someone who used the decoy's escape to distract from their plan. Her eyes settled on Clara. "Clara, you've been honest, but not entirely. You knew the combination, didn't you? You saw Lady Hargrove enter it." Clara's sobs grew louder. I did, miss. I didn't mean to, but I saw it once, weeks ago. I never told anyone." Miss Marple nodded. "And someone else saw you watching, perhaps? Or guessed you knew?" She turned to the group. The thief used Clara's vulnerability, her debts, her past mistake at the shop, to cast suspicion on her. But the plan was flawed. The pendant was moved too quickly, the tin too obvious. Dr. Ellis raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting someone else in this room?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "I suggest we look at motive and opportunity. Mr. Wilkins, you knew the combination and the pedestal's secret, but your loyalty to the manor is clear, and you were seen by the roses." She turned to Miss Finch. "Miss Finch, your sharp tongue points to Lady Hargrove's finances, but you've no access to the aviary. Reverend, your kindness blinds you to deceit, and Dr. Ellis, your detachment keeps you at a distance." She paused, her eyes returning to Clara. "Clara, your mother's illness drove you to desperation. You staged the decoy's escape to test the latch, used the screwdriver to scratch the lock, and hid the pendant in the pedestal's compartment, planning to retrieve it later. But when suspicion fell on you, you panicked, moving it to your room, hoping to shift blame elsewhere." Clara's sobs broke into a wail. "I did it, miss. I'm sorry. I needed the money for my mother's medicine. I thought I could sell the pendant and replace it before anyone noticed. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Lady Hargrove's face softened, her eyes glistening. "Oh, Clara, why didn't you tell me? I'd have helped." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Desperation clouds judgment, Evelyn, like a girl in my village who stole to save her family, only to regret it." Hayes stepped forward, his expression grim. "I'll have to take her in, Miss Marple. Theft's a serious matter." Miss Marple nodded. "Do what you must, Sergeant, but Clara's heart is not that of a thief. Mercy, Evelyn, might mend this wound." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling over them. Clara, tears streaming, was led away by Hayes, her confession echoing in the quiet. Lady Hargrove clutched the pendant, her relief tempered by sorrow. The aviary, visible through the window, stood serene, its birds oblivious to the human drama. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her eyes soft but satisfied. "The truth," she said, "is like a bird in a cage. Set it free, and it finds its way home." Chapter 12. Peace restored. The sun hung low over Elmwood Manor, casting long shadows across the gardens and bathing the aviary's glass dome in a soft amber glow. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of damp earth and fading roses, a gentle reminder of the season's turn. In St. Mary Mead, the village had settled into its usual rhythm, though the theft of Lady Hargrove's sapphire pendant lingered in the collective memory, a tale already weaving itself into the fabric of local lore. Within the manor's walls, the tension that had gripped the household for days was beginning to dissipate, like mist under the morning sun. The revelation of Clara Benson's guilt, delivered with Miss Jane Marple's quiet precision, had brought clarity, if not complete comfort, to the affair. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting bag at her feet, her needles clicking with a steady rhythm that seemed to soothe the room's lingering unease. The fire crackled softly, its warmth a contrast to the cool light filtering through the windows. Lady Hargrove, the sapphire pendant once more at her throat, sat opposite, her face a study in relief tempered by sorrow. The pendant's recovery had restored a piece of her past, but Clara's confession had left a wound, one that would take time to heal. "Jane," Lady Hargrove said, her voice soft but steady, "I cannot thank you enough. You've given me back more than my pendant. You've given me the truth. But poor Clara, I never imagined she'd be driven to such a thing." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp yet kind, met her friend's. "Human nature, Evelyn, is a fragile thing, like a fine thread stretched too tight. Clara's heart was in the right place, though her actions strayed. In my village, I once knew a lad who took a silver spoon to pay for his sister's medicine. Desperation blinds us to consequence." Lady Hargrove nodded, her fingers brushing the pendant. "I've spoken to Sergeant Hayes. I won't press charges. Clara's suffered enough, and her mother needs her. I've arranged for a doctor to see to her mother's care, and Clara will stay on, if she wishes." Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "A generous choice, Evelyn. Mercy, like a well-knitted scarf, warms both giver and receiver. Clara's young, and youth learns from its mistakes." The drawing-room door opened, and Sergeant Hayes entered, his notebook tucked away, his mustache less bristly than usual. "Miss Marple, Lady Hargrove," he said, tipping his helmet. "I've just come from speaking with Clara. She's shaken, but grateful. She's promised to make amends, and with her ladyship's kindness, I think she'll do right." Miss Marple's needles paused. "I'm glad to hear it, Sergeant. A girl like Clara needs guidance, not punishment. The aviary, I trust, is secure once more?" Hayes nodded. "I've checked the lock myself. New combination, and I've advised her ladyship to keep it private. The latch is fixed, and the pedestal's compartment is empty. No more surprises, I hope." Lady Hargrove's lips curved in a faint smile. "I've learned my lesson, Jane. No more jewels in the aviary. It's for the birds, not my treasures." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A wise decision. Treasures, like secrets, are safest when guarded with care." The manor's other occupants filtered into the room, drawn by the resolution of the mystery. Mr. Wilkins, his scowl softened by the outcome, stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. "I'm glad it's sorted," he said gruffly. "Didn't like being under suspicion, but I reckon Clara didn't mean harm." Miss Lydia Finch, seated on a sofa, her arms no longer crossed in judgment, offered a rare nod of approval. "Well, Jane, you've outdone yourself. I thought it was Clara from the start, but I didn't see the half of it, rehearsals and hidden compartments. You've a mind like a steel trap." Miss Marple's smile was modest. "I merely observe, Miss Finch. People, like my knitting, reveal their patterns if you watch closely." Dr. Ellis, leaning against a bookcase, adjusted his glasses with a wry smile. "A remarkable performance, Miss Marple. The feathers, the scratches. It was all a stage play, wasn't it? Clara played her part, but you saw through the script." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "A play, yes, doctor, but a simple one. In my village, a girl once staged a theft to cover a debt, scattering crumbs to mislead. Clara's plan was much the same, clever, but not clever enough." Reverend Thompson, his kindly face beaming, clasped his hands. "You've brought peace to this house, Miss Marple. It reminds me of the parable of the lost sheep, found and returned to the fold." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "A fitting comparison, Reverend. Clara was lost, but kindness has brought her home." The conversation turned to lighter matters, the room's atmosphere lifting as the weight of suspicion dissolved. Lady Hargrove rose, her poise returning. "I must insist you all stay for tea," she said. "It's the least I can do after such an ordeal." The group agreed, and the drawing room soon filled with the clink of teacups and the murmur of conversation. Clara, summoned from the kitchen, entered hesitantly, her eyes red but her posture straighter. Lady Hargrove approached her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Clara, my dear, you're welcome here. Let's put this behind us." Clara's voice trembled with gratitude. "Thank you, my lady. I'll never forget your kindness." Miss Marple watched the exchange, her needles clicking softly. She thought of a young woman in her village, forgiven for a theft, who had gone on to live a quiet, honest life. "Second chances," she murmured to herself, "are the stitches that mend a torn fabric." As tea was served, the talk turned to the aviary itself, now free of its role as a stage for deceit. Mr. Wilkins spoke of new plantings to complement the birds' habitat, while Dr. Ellis suggested a study of their behavior, his scientific curiosity undimmed. Miss Finch, ever practical, proposed a stronger lock, though her tone was less sharp than usual. Reverend Thompson offered a blessing for the manor's peace, his words a gentle balm. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes drifting to the window where the aviary gleamed in the fading light. The birds within fluttered among the ferns, their colors a vivid reminder of life's simple joys. She thought of the decoy's escape, the scratched padlock, the hidden compartment, all pieces of a puzzle now resolved. Yet the true puzzle, she knew, was the human heart, with its mix of loyalty and desperation, kindness and error. Sergeant Hayes, seated nearby, leaned toward her. "Miss Marple, you've a gift for this. Ever thought of joining the force?" Miss Marple's laugh was soft, like a chime in the quiet. "Oh, Sergeant, I'm far too fond of my knitting, but I'll always lend a hand when St. Mary Mead needs it." Lady Hargrove joined them, her pendant catching the firelight. "Jane, you must visit again, under happier circumstances. The aviary will be open to all, and I promise, no more jewels inside." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I look forward to it, Evelyn. Birds, you see, are far less troublesome than people." As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple prepared to depart, her knitting bag packed and her scarf a little longer for her efforts. The manor's staff and guests bid her farewell, their gratitude evident in their smiles. Clara, lingering by the door, offered a shy nod, her eyes bright with hope. Mr. Wilkins tipped his cap, a rare gesture of respect. Even Miss Finch managed a grudging compliment, her usual sharpness softened by the resolution. Miss Marple stepped into the garden, the cool air bracing against her cheeks. The aviary stood serene, its glass walls reflecting the golden sky. She paused, her gaze lingering on the birds within, their wings a blur of color. "Like people," she murmured, "they flutter and fret, but find their way in the end." The walk back to her cottage was peaceful, the village lanes quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. St. Mary Mead had resumed its tranquil pace, the tale of the bewitched birdcage already fading into tea-time chatter. Miss Marple settled by her fire that evening, her needles clicking as she reflected on the case. The pendant's recovery, Clara's redemption, Lady Hargrove's mercy, all were stitches in a pattern she understood well. Human nature, with its flaws and virtues, was as predictable as the seasons, yet ever fascinating. She thought of a similar incident in her youth, when a village girl hid a stolen locket in a hayloft, her guilt undone by a single careless word. "We weave our own webs," Miss Marple mused, "and sometimes we're lucky enough to be freed from them." The firelight danced on her knitting, casting shadows that merged with the quiet of the night. Elmwood Manor, its peace restored, would carry on, its aviary a symbol of beauty rather than deceit. And in St. Mary Mead, life would continue, with its gossip and its kindness, its mysteries and its resolutions, all part of the intricate tapestry that Miss Marple loved to unravel.